This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to Special Edition Episode 27 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, August 4th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today's episode is going to be basically a wrap-up of the Sunstone Symposium. Basically, it was a convention for all Mormon nerds, and I felt right at home. It was so amazing. To kind of give you an idea of what Sunstone really is, more than just a Mormon nerd convention, it's a place where Mormons and non-Mormons can gather together and talk about basically the hard issues in Mormonism. There's presentations by authors and historians and podcasters and, people that are like directors of foundations. It's a big mix of believers and non-believers where they can come together and have open discussion, not tiptoe around some of the hard issues. It was really awesome. So I was just geeking out the whole time. I was able to interview some authors and historians and podcasters that I revere and frequently cite as sources for my own research. And you're going to hear those today. We have snippets from Grant Palmer, D. Michael Quinn, H. Michael Marquardt, John Hammond, Lindsay Park, and John Dehlin on today's episodes. Of course, I'll kind of introduce the audio clips before they play just to let you know what we're going to talk about and, where you can find all of their information. So to get us started, we're going to go with Grant Palmer's discussion. Now, I have to tell you, I was just carrying around a pocket recorder the whole time. There was a lot of background noise, so some of the audio quality really isn't that great, but the content in the audio is what's fantastic. Talking to these scholars and these podcasters about what they have done, about their work, asking them deep questions about it. It's really a lot of fun. So, like I said, the first clip is going to be from Grant Palmer. He is the author of An Insider's View of Mormon Origins, and he was actually one of the first, I guess you could call anti-Mormon presentations that I ever watched. And it's just a thing that he did with the Ex-Mormon Foundation, and it's on YouTube. It's called My Aha Moments While Researching Mormon History. It's a great video. He just does an hour-long presentation, basically, where he's standing in front of the pulpit and just talking. He's not really, he doesn't have any slides, no paper, no anything. He's just talking at the audience, and it's an amazing video. So, of course, those will both be linked, an Amazon link for the Insider's View of Mormon Origins, as well as the YouTube video I'm talking about. Those are going to be linked in the show notes, so be sure to check them out. So without any further ado, this is my interview with Grant Palmer, and once again, my apologies for the terrible audio quality. I'm sitting down here with Grant Palmer, author of An Insider View of Mormon Origins, one of the most recommended books that I recommend on the podcast because it is such a fantastic deconstruction. And actually, Grant Palmer was one of the first people that I ever was introduced to with the Ex-Mormon stories and Ex-Mormon Foundation. He has this video online called My Aha Moments When Researching Mormon History, and can you tell us a little bit about that presentation? It's just so fascinating.
What to say about that? I wasn't prepared for that. I mean, I didn't write anything down. I did do a little bit of thinking about it, and it just kind of just came out.
Really? Wow. That's amazing.
And it turned out pretty good. I've listened to it since I gave it, and I thought it was one of my better efforts. As I mentioned to you a minute ago, I think there's been at least 100,000 people on Mormon Think that have listened, or at least hit the button to view it. I don't know if they listened to it all. But
and it is over an hour long. And at one point in the video, you're saying, "Oh, I got to speed up. There's only this much time left." And then the presenters, shouts from the back of the room, "You have 40 minutes or something," and everybody cheers because it's so amazing. It's just the information you're presenting is so amazing.
Well, you really can't understand early Mormon history unless you understand some of the things I said in that lecture.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's really important, that people need to know the rest of the story. And that's why I've done everything I've done, is they haven't wanted the rest of the story out. I think Richard Bushman this week made some comment to the effect that the general authorities don't know their own history. Okay, I agree with that, but they know enough to hide it.
Or they know enough to set out the proper committees to present it in a way that sounds like it's hidden from our perspective.
Of course, all of that is going away now. They're starting to cooperate, not fully, but cooperate. But when Joseph Fielding Smith hides or puts in his office safes an 1832 account of the first vision, which is now out and about,
right?
He knows there's problems with that version, and that version has been around. It was brought across the plains. It's not like it was discovered in some archive holding. They had that.
It wasn't Wesley Walters digging in the basement of the courthouse.
He or one of his assistants tore it out of the journal where it resided, and then put it back in 1965 for someone to discover it.
Yeah.
But they know enough about Mormon history to know that it has serious problems.
Well, let's talk on that for just a second here, because I think one reason why your book is so valuable is because you spend so much time deconstructing the different versions of the first vision accounts. You go through the various claims of the priesthood restoration and of the angel Moroni, which wasn't called Moroni for many, many years. The various apostolic or these manifestations of angels, and you deconstruct them chronologically. Basically, you say this is what it says in the 1832 version. This is what it says in the 34-35 version. This is what it says in the 38 version that was published in 42 as the history of the church.
Yeah, I take a historical approach. My book, Insider's View, is the first half is about the Book of Mormon. The last half is about the four visions, foundational visions of the church. And what attracted me is that it wasn't just one, but all four evolved.
Yeah, that's the craziest part, isn't it?
They get more unique and physical and impressive and, yes, miraculous.
Miraculous.
And that,
legendary, one might say.
And that is what really, I thought, well, there's no orthodox answer for this, because all four of them, the angel gold plate story, the priesthood, the first vision, and the 8 witness story especially, they all are embellished. A good friend of mine is a federal judge, and he says, when I get that kind of testimony in my court, it's impeached.
Right. And you can identify it so blatantly, too.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I approached it that way, and I think that's one reason it has caused many people to pause and think of what they learned in church maybe wasn't quite so.
Well, and that's the way you need to analyze these things as a witness testimony, because as a witness testimony, as time progresses, details tend to get more fuzzy, more vague.
Yeah.
They don't get more grand and epic.
I mentioned that in my book.
That's a big problem with the competing narratives as it progressed from 1832 on to 1838.
And I don't think Joseph Smith cares if he lets someone else clean up the logical messes, and and the problems.
Oliver Cowdery
he just moves on and teaches his new thing, whatever that is. It's an amazing thing.
His ability to ignore what has happened in the past, I think, was remarkable.
Well, it's catching up with him. I probably shouldn't say too much, but I had a BYU professor call me about a month ago from the religion department, no less.
Wow.
He says, I've had a burst of integrity and I can't do this anymore.
Oh, my goodness.
I says, are you the only one? He says, no, there's a few of us. I probably shouldn't say things like that because they might start purging.
Right? No kidding. Well, that's the problem, too, is it takes believers a very small amount of time to start researching this before they start to have some very big questions, right? And isn't that kind of the aim of the Sunstone Symposium, to try and answer these questions and still continue to believe if you want? Or, I think one of the mottos is, more than one way to Mormon, right? Where they can say, you can still understand these, you can still know the history, but you can still believe in the church.
And some of the reasons for staying are getting pretty strange. I have a cousin. He's a professor back east, and he says, well, even if Joseph Smith was a con man, even though the history is, problematic, I still believe in the restoration. I'm going to take that part of it that we like, and we'll build on that. And I thought, you could say the same thing with the Third Reich.
Right. Or any
Hitler
of the...
Hitler was a con man.
Yeah.
And I liked Albert Speer's, his architecture. He was the architect. So why don't we just take his architecture and start building on that? What's the difference? I mean,
right. And Joseph Goebbels released some really impressive propaganda and stuff. I really liked what he wrote.
So the sociological study of listening to people justify hanging on to Mormonism is just incredible to me.
Well, and to anybody that's interested in anthropology in general, understanding the human condition of the need to believe in something. Yeah, I think they can be fascinated by a lot of the things that are being presented here. There's something going on right now is how to embrace LGBTQIA children into the church. Including LGBTQIA children.
I think I'm going to go to that session.
Yeah, me too. Just because that's a big problem. Like that's the problems that the church was having in the late 70s with blacks in the priesthood. That's the same issue with LGBTQIA.
Well, and see, I'm a historian, and people have trouble with the history, but now you've got all these social issues like the one you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. But the church is, or at least the church and the church members are changing the goalposts. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day about how do you send out 88,000 missionaries and have, 247,000 converts? Yeah. Gosh, I went on a mission in 1962. We were there's like 11,000 missionaries, and I think we're getting that many, or close to it.
Well, and I think the uptick in the when they changed the age from 19 to 18 for missionaries, they saw. Was it like a 45% increase in the number of missionaries? Like, that's huge. But they only saw an 18% increase in actual new converts.
Yeah, so
that's a problem. That's not a return on investment.
So given that discussion, this person says to me, well, I think they sent the missionaries out to convert themselves.
Yeah.
And I thought, boy, that's not what they told me when I want to. They have changed the goalpost, baby.
Yeah. No kidding.
It's not just to convert them. It was to convert the world, a great stone that's rolling forth to fill the earth. See, they backed off that. They're now starting to quote Boyd Packer in a conference address, 2-3 years before he died, said, well, in the end, it prophesies here in Nephi that the church will be worldwide but small. And so that's the model they're now and the members that are there will leaven the loaf of the bread. Okay, this is all fine, but I'm just saying they've changed the goalposts.
Right. Well, because so long they've touted we're the fastest growing membership, fastest growing church ever, and not talking about because they have twice the birth rate of the rest of the world.
They push it.
Yeah, but they do say we are obviously true because we're the fastest growing church. Now they're saying we're obviously true because we're we have a small subsect of
another
true believers.
Example of the changing the goalposts.
Yeah, amazing. So I don't want to keep you too much longer. I mean, we've about 10 minutes now. This has been great. It was just a pleasure to see you, up in the climate change and Mormon money lecture that we were just in. That was quite a fascinating lecture. I enjoyed that.
It was,
and I admire your work, and I appreciate you publishing Insider's View of Mormon Origins. Oh, one more thing I wanted to ask you about. I think you talked about this in my aha moments, the seer stones. Yes. You got an insider's view of the seer stones, didn't you?
Yeah, I saw them about 50 years ago in the church office building, the First Presidency's vault. Assistant historian brought them out, and I handled 3 of them.
That's so
well.
amazing.
I handled one of them. He showed us 3 of them.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in the one that was reportedly responsible for our entire current Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
So, with the plates not around,
the stone is the closest thing we get.
The stone is the biggest artifact they've got on the restoration. Really.
But yeah, I mean, you were there. The church for the majority of my life has been denying the idea of this seer stones, or not talking about it at least. But you, 50 years ago, you were touring the church vault, and you were able to hold the seer stones in your hand.
Yeah,
that is an insider's view right there. That's just remarkable.
And that stone was used for primarily the first 18 sections in the Doctrine and Covenants, so it's not just unimportant to the Mormon movement. It was, and that's the same stone he used to allegedly find treasure.
Yeah, exactly. That he found in the Chase's well, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
And he basically stole from the Chases, essentially.
He wouldn't give it back.
He wouldn't give it back. Yeah, exactly. That's just fantastic. That's something that not a whole lot of people can say, that they saw the seer stone before the church released the pictures back in, was it 2013?
I tried to get a picture of that for my insider book.
Oh, I'm sure.
No, we can't do that. None of that.
Oh, of course.
And I couldn't even get the person I thought had access to even ask the question. So now they put it out on the screen and go down there and see pictures of it at the church museum.
Yep. Oh, and there's this press release recently of Dieter Uchtdorf holding up an iPhone saying, that's basically how it worked. Joseph could see whatever he wanted in just like we can use an iPhone today. I think he's missing the point. And, he's not couching it in.
If he really believes that, then why doesn't he tell us what he sees in the stone? He is a prophet, seer, and revelator.
Yeah, a seer. That's the most important. That's an operative term.
And yet he would, I think, would probably not have a lot of faith in that stone. If they did, they'd be using it, wouldn't they?
You would think so. To divine God's nature or God's will through
any question.
Yeah, right. It would come up with a new revelation. It's been since the 70s that they've had a new revelation.
Well, the same thing is true with that book of Abraham. If that really was the scroll of Joseph and the scroll of Abraham, that would be the most ancient documents that we have in our possession.
Oh, yeah.
That would be trotted out to the world, but they know it isn't that, so they keep them in that dark vault.
And just don't talk about it. Yeah. That's great. Oh. Well, Grant, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to meet you. And, thanks for sitting down with me for a few minutes to talk.
Thanks for saying hello.
All right, and that was my discussion with Grant Palmer. He was a really fantastic guy to interview. There was some stuff we talked about while the recorder wasn't on that I wanted to include, but I hadn't started actually recording. But still, Grant's just a great guy. I had seen him in other videos and other discussions, not necessarily debates, but discussions, and I always wanted to talk to him. So this was a great opportunity to snag him and talk to him for a minute. All right, the next interview that I conducted was with D. Michael Quinn. Now, for anybody that isn't aware of who D. Michael Quinn is, he was a BYU professor in Mormon historical studies from like 1970-something to 1980-something when he resigned, and he was one of the September 6 as well that was excommunicated in 1993. So a big chunk of this guy's life has been nothing but Mormonism and Mormon history. So he's just a really intelligent guy, extremely articulate, and he has a couple of a few books out there, one of which I've read little snippets out of. I haven't read all the way through, which is Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. It's a really great book, but of course he has other books on the way, one of which is basically a Mormon money book. And he has done a huge amount of scholarship on Mormon money. I had heard about this book being rumored around maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, and I was hoping to ask him about it, and we actually get to that in the interview, so be sure to stick around for this one. It was really great. Once again, there's a lot of background noise, and I had to smash around the audio a lot to get it to come out, but all in all, the content is really, really good. So be sure to check the show notes for the Wikipedia page of D. Michael Quinn, and it has all of his books listed there. And, it was a really great discussion. Without further ado, this is D. Michael Quinn. All right, I'm sitting down here with D. Michael Quinn, well-known Mormon historian, author, and he's quite prolific in the Mormon sphere. So we're going to talk about some of the books that he's written, as well as a book that's coming up here, if I'm not mistaken. So if you don't mind, Mike, just kind of give us a rap sheet.
Okay, there is a set of books that I've published, and then I have some electronic publications that I'll just mention to you as well.
Even better.
The first one that many people look at is Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview.
Yes.
Its 1998 edition is the version that I recommend because that's twice the size of the original.
It has all of the... I know that you're an author that's quite... You spend a lot of time in the appendices of the books, right. Not quite as much time and space in the actual legitimate portion
and in
of
the footnotes.
Yeah, in the footnotes.
So there's that one, that's 1998, but even before that, in 1994, there's the first volume of what I call the Mormon Hierarchy series, and it's Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power, in 1994. In 1997, it was Origins of Power Extensions. Mormon Hierarchy Extensions of Power. The first book, Origins, dealt with Joseph Smith period up to the arrival of Brigham Young in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. The second volume covers from 1848 to 1996. The third volume is supposed to come out before the end of this year. It's called, the subtitle there is Mormon Hierarchy, Wealth, and Corporate Power. And that covers church finances and business corporations from 1830 to 2010.
So that's the book that I kind of teased everybody with that's going to be coming out.
Going to be coming.
And I have to say, I watched a lecture, not really a lecture, but a presentation that you were giving with Mark Thomas, was that his name?
Yeah.
And you guys were talking about the possible impact of climate change on the church's assets.
Right.
And it's really, really fascinating because, I'd known for a while, since that Bloomberg News article came out in 2012, that the church has vast amounts of wealth in Florida, real estate holdings, property holdings there. And, there's a fair amount of it that's, threatened by the rising sea level.
Yeah, over the next few decades, it definitely will be, including at least one temple in Fort Lauderdale. But that's not something that I emphasized. I was responding to Mark Thomas's emphasis on that.
Yeah.
But it is a reality that in South Florida, the ground level is no more than 10 feet above sea level, and the projected rise of the oceans is anywhere from 10 to 30 feet.
That's going to be a big problem.
So it's going to be a severe problem for Miami, for everyone, all businesses as well as residents there. But anyway, he deals with that.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about your book that's coming out. I think fascinating.
I look at business and finance, and I don't deference to the publisher, I don't want to give too many details. Okay. But I have about 30 appendices and tables that look at the finances in detail, dollar amounts. And
so just like early Mormonism and the Magic World View, 30% of it will be the actual book, while the remaining 70% is all the appendices.
Yeah, and they've estimated, Signature Books has estimated that it would be 800 pages in print.
That is
that's
book.
Their estimate. I don't know, but that's what they estimate.
And it just goes to show how much work you've put into this. I had heard this book teased a long time ago, probably a year and a half ago, that somebody, D. Michael Quinn is doing a book on Mormon money, look forward to that. And ever since then, I've been salivating over it, wanting to
You and me
read
both,
this.
But they've had a backlog, and it's finally reached the top of the pile, and they're doing the editing on it now, so
That's
it
exciting.
may be out before the end of the year.
Wow.
The other books that I published in 1996, they're one about same-sex dynamics among 19th century Americans, and the subtitle is A Mormon Example.
That's something that I actually cited in one of my podcasts as trying to talk about the very conservative perspective of the church on LGBTQ issues right now, and how that isn't necessarily a vestige of early Mormonism.
No.
Now, this is just kind of an advent of like the, 50s
Well,
and 60s?
actually, in both cases, the homophobia of the present, or the most recent 50 years, and the relatively open attitudes of the LDS Church in the 19th century both reflected the national culture. In the national culture, friendship among males was very touchy-feely.
Interesting.
And the Mormon record keepers were so good that I'm able to demonstrate what we know as a general pattern in American society from isolated examples in Boston and New York and Florida, wherever, and then show in a very detailed way how this was played out in Mormon culture, which reflected this openness that the book describes. And so I use Mormonism as a case study for this general openness that existed. It actually coexisted with repressiveness, but in many ways it was an easier way for people who were sexually attracted to one another of the same gender to survive and to prosper during that time period. So that's a book that I published with the University of Illinois Press. The third one and the last one that I haven't mentioned so far is a biography of a church leader who was also a U.S. diplomat. And that was J. Reuben Clark, and I called the book Elder Statesman, and that came out in 2002. Now, the electronic publications, there are 2 or 3 that are accessible there, and it would be of, some interest even to non-Mormons. There's one that is available, and if you do a search on Quinn, Joseph Smith, and sexual dimension, it's about a 75-page article in PDF format about the sexual side of Joseph Smith's polygamy. That's the title. Okay. And that's available in PDF format online if you do a Google search on it. There's another one that is available through the website of Dialogue Magazine, and it's electronic PDF of the camp meeting environment of Joseph Smith's first vision. And it's about the revivals that led to the first vision of Joseph Smith. So I'm not looking at his account of the first vision. I'm looking at what he said preceded it and what I find as evidence and the problem of people who have looked at this evidence before and ignored much of it. Right, so I talk about that. So those are 2 that are online that are available as PDFs.
Fantastic. So, like I said, very, very prolific in your writing.
Yeah, I've tried to be.
And I do have to say, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, that's a book that I have sitting on my nightstand that I picked up from Amazon a while back, and it's piling up in a list of books that I'm trying to get through.
Well, a lot of these are like doorstops, and so I recommend people, if you're not really determined to read the footnotes. Don't look at the endnotes.
Right.
And if you're reading the Hierarchy series, each of those 2 volumes has a chronology, and I'd recommend reading the chronology first, because the chronology provides a good overview of what the book deals with in more precise detail.
I think that's important because people understand chronological progression so much easier than they do just taking like one topic and examining it. I mean, this is what my podcast is, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Episode 1 starts with the birth of Joseph Smith. Episode 2 introduces Emma Smith, and it just progresses chronologically.
And the same-sex book also has a chronology, which I would recommend reading first.
So let me ask you this. This is something I've never asked any other Mormon historian, and I don't think any other Mormon historian would feel comfortable speculating on this, and you might not either, but I'm going to throw it out there, kind of going into uncharted territory. What do you think were kind of I'm trying to think of how to word this. Do you think there was any evidence to suggest that Joseph Smith wasn't strictly monogamous or polygamist heterosexual? Do you think there may have been some other relations that were going on?
No, I talk about his emotional connection with men in the same-sex dynamics book.
That's what I find
he
so
was
fascinating.
deeply connected emotionally, and they were connected deeply with him.
I mean, John Bennett is a great example. I mean, Sidney Rigdon.
But also many converts. I mean, people have commented about how almost sexual the response of women talking about their first encounters with Joseph Smith as a preacher or as a prophet, and it's the charisma affected them in a way that's almost romantic, almost sexual. And males often report the same kind of overwhelming response to Joseph Smith.
Really?
But Joseph Smith at this time period lived in American society that valued these same-sex friendships, where it was very common for men to sleep together. And overnight, or for weeks at a time, or sometimes years at a time.
Wow!
And Joseph valued this, and he spoke about it in sermons, and he used it in one case as an example of the resurrection. But he talked about friends falling asleep together in one another's arms.
Yes,
talking about their love for one another.
Yes, I found when I saw that, or I read that, and I saw your citation on it. That's what I quoted in the episode.
And I talk about that, but people assume that when I talk about this, I'm equating it with sex.
Right.
No, and it was 90% of Americans and Mormons who slept with same-sex partners, whether it was females with females or males with males, did not feel erotic interest, but they felt emotional. There was a love interest. Okay. There was a love interest with this person. And Joseph Smith, the last night of his life before he was killed by a mob, shared a bed with a 32-year-old married man. And
John Taylor, right?
No, it was Daniel Jones.
Daniel Jones?
Yeah, Dan Jones. He was a missionary to the Welsh. He was a Welsh convert, and he served a mission to the Welsh. And he, in the Carthage jail, made a bed that night with Joseph Smith, and talks about being in close embrace with him the night before he was killed.
And that's just something that Mormons don't know about.
No,
they don't know about the
about
6-shooter pistol that he had.
No.
They don't know about the wine and tobacco.
Right.
And I had no idea that there was, say his name again?
Dan Jones.
Dan Jones. I had no idea there was another man that Joe was sleeping in the same bed with.
And there was one of his secretaries. He spent a great deal of time with a male secretary who was married, a young man who had a wife and children. And the family narrative is that one time Joseph Smith apologized to her for taking her husband away so much, but he says, "I love this man and I'm married to him." I use that, and I say I think this is symbolic, but he used the words.
Yeah, exactly.
He said the words, and I don't think it was sexual, because I think Joseph Smith was overwhelmingly attracted to women, and he had 30. At a minimum of 35 wives. I think it was closer to 45 plural wives, and the relationships were sexual. But he had this which was valued at the time, this emotional connection with males.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, many men talked of their love of him. I quote people who refer to him giving their final conversation with him. He kisses them goodbye on his way to Carthage jail and says, "Remember, I love you."
That's amazing.
I mean, these relationships were deeply emotional, and they were tactile. And I distinguished between the homoerotic of that time period and the homotactile, where they enjoyed holding one another's hands, sleeping together, kissing even in public. It was a Mormon as well as an American pattern, but it wasn't erotic for 80% of the people.
I think I read that you showed a photo of it, or you're discussing a photo where there's just a photo from like the 1860s of just like one man with his hand on another man's leg, right? That was not considered like taboo homoeroticism. Right. It was just they were friends.
And in Utah, this continued for teenagers down to the 1940s.
Wow.
In athletic teams, you find photographs of them down to the 1940s with hands on legs and sometimes very close to the groin. And we would see this as sexual, but they just saw it as friendship.
Right. It's so odd how much more conservative things have become now, and how it's so much more taboo now.
And I talk about the change of friendship. Okay. That friendship changed because of the Oscar Wilde trial in 1895, which introduced both Americans and Brits to the idea that there is a group of males who are attracted sexually to males, and there had not been that awareness in the general population. And so they did not consider there being any danger in the touchy-feely quality of male-male friendship prior to that time. After the Oscar Wilde trial, by the early decades of the 20th century, male friendship becomes very distant. And you can trace this in YMCA photographs. You can trace it in photographs of male sports teams, where up until the World War I, basically, very common to see males holding one another in very intimate ways on teams. After that, they make sure that they have spaces in between. They're not touching one another. I mean, it's a very obvious physical representation of homophobia that enters male-male relationships after the 1895 trial of Oscar Wilde. And male-male friendship changes after that. And so I talked a lot about what male-male friendship was before that, and how females generally were not under the same scrutiny, mainly because males did not see women as sexual objects for each other. And so for women to sleep with one another and be kissed in public and to hold hands in public, no one thought anything about that.
Well, and I know, like, during the 1920s, there was this evolution in marriage that seemed to baffle people's minds, where people were starting to marry for love now.
That's right.
Instead of being a business deal.
And in 19th century, the husband and wife were encouraged to be almost like business partners, and that their closest associations and intimacy should be with same-sex friends. Wow. And that changed in the 20th century. So I trace all these issues, the definitions and the encouragement for kind of a lack of intimacy, real intimacy in marriage in the 19th century, to becoming emphasizing intimacy in marriage and romantic love in marriage, and a change from male-male, in particularly male-male touchy-feely friendship in the 19th century to stay away from me. I'm not going to be classed as a Oscar Wilde kind of person. And that changes. And both of those changes happen from the 19th century to the 20th century.
So, okay, let me get your thoughts then. Often people understand, the typical Mormon marriage ceremony, the sealing ceremony, as, between one man and one woman. Basically the family, the proclamation to the world centered idea of this nuclear family.
But was it Wilford Woodruff that stopped the law of adoption?
Yes.
How do you think that these intimate feelings for same-sex people kind of played into the law of adoption?
It didn't, because the law of adoption was a man and sometimes his wife or wives, if he was a polygamist, was adopted to an apostle. And so that the apostle and this adopted man had a father-son relationship. Okay. So it didn't have anything to do with friendship, really, because it was creating a father-son relationship between the adopted father and the adopted son. However, it became confused because Brigham Young and others referred to this as the sealing of men to men. And so people...
Right. That's how I see it.
And so people... because sealing is usually referred to in a marital sexual sense within 19th century Mormonism, that phrase, sealing of men to men, all of a sudden had sexual implications.
Right, exactly.
But it was adoption, and it was adoption like we think of adoption, where an adult male adopts a child, and that's how they saw it. Okay. And so when the adoptions first started in Nauvoo, the adopted son, who was very often already a husband and father himself, would refer to the apostle as father. And sometimes he would adopt the apostle's name. So like John Dehlin in Nauvoo was adopted to Brigham Young as his adopted son, and John Dehlin began signing his name, John Dehlin Young.
Really?
Because he felt that he was now a spiritual son of Brigham Young. So they didn't see it in sexual terms. They saw it as we would define the term adoption, as an adult adopting a child. Okay. But in this case, the child might already be a man with wives and children.
So is this the same John Dehlin, just as a sidetrack of Mount
Meadows Massacre?
Okay,
yes.
I was wondering if that...
Yes, he was an adopted son of Brigham Young.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so good to know, because I'd always I've been trying to formulate an informed perspective of what the law of adoption is.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you clarifying.
And that was what happened. And what they were doing up until 1897, when Wilford Woodruff ended it, people were tracing their ancestry as far back as they could, and they were sealing a literal son to literal father, until they could no longer find genealogy. And then they would seal the last person that they could identify to Joseph Smith.
Really?
Yeah.
So it was sealing the whole line.
And the idea was sealing a line. Wow. and completing a line. And then Wilford Woodruff said, no, let's stop doing this. Mm-hmm. Trace your ancestry as far back as you can and keep sealing literal son to literal father to literal daughter to literal father until you can find no more, and then don't adopt them to Joseph Smith or anyone else. Wait until you or your children find more ancestry that you can then do the sealing of father to son and daughter to father.
I wasn't aware that was a driving factor of so much of Mormon genealogy.
Yeah.
I thought it was always just so we could do baptisms for them.
No,
but
it was
for sealing them as far back as we could go.
Sealing as parents to children and parents to wives, or parents to each other.
Wow, because even my grandmother has done. About 12 years back, she did a mission, just genealogy mission, and ever since the mission was over, the 2-year mission was over, she's just made it her life's work to do our family genealogy.
Right. And
she's gone back to like the 1200s and the 1400s, finding lines all the way back.
Right.
Eventually, the idea, ideally, is to get as far back as we possibly can, and then tack them onto Joseph Smith.
Yeah, well, that's what they used to do. But sometimes the Mormon convert didn't know their grandparents' names.
Yeah.
And so they knew who their father was, and so they would be sealed to their father and their mother in the temple, and they didn't know who their father and mother's parents were, and so then they would seal their father and their mother to Joseph Smith.
Okay.
And that's what that's what Wilford Woodruff ended in 1897. He said, keep it within your actual biological family.
so fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't want to take up any more of your time. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Sure. Yeah, I'm
Mike,
glad to.
Thank you so much. It was a great
And you have my email, and
I do.
you can
Yes,
email
definitely.
me whenever.
All right, that was my discussion with D. Michael Quinn, and I have to say, that was coming on the heels of a presentation that Mark Thomas had given, who is a believer. Basically, you can call him an apologist, but D. Michael Quinn responded to that presentation. And what it is basically how climate change is going to affect the church's finances. Mark Thomas, who had done all of the research for this, he looked at all of the land that's just in Florida alone, no other coastlines, no other countries, just in Florida alone. That's church-owned land that's under 10 feet above sea level. So the fear is, the threat is, the possibility is that the water levels are going to rise a significant amount, anywhere from 1 to 3 meters within the next couple of decades. And when that happens, a large chunk of Florida is going to be underwater. So he looked at just the sheer numbers of what it will look like if the sea level rises 10 feet in Florida, which is very, very possible given the scientific models that we have. So let me just recite some of the notes that I took here. Yeah, he said there's 383,000 acres that the church owns in the Panhandle that will be underwater, and that includes 16 chapels and 1 temple. Now, he used a little bit of research as far as real estate values and property values, and he kind of came up with a rough estimate of what we're looking at. And he said with the typical chapels, they're on anywhere from 3 to 4 acre lots of land. So that's about $16 million for the construction of a chapel, of the typical chapel. For a temple, just a normal temple, where I think he took the example of the temple that is there in the Fort Lauderdale, the one that's going to be threatened. The construction costs are anywhere from $11 to $12 million, which totals the land cost and everything up to about $20 million. So basically what he figured out was that anywhere from $500 to $600 million worth of church assets are going to be underwater within the next couple of decades, which is really, really fascinating, to be honest. And, this is, D. Michael Quinn responded to this because he's coming out with the book on Mormon money, the Hierarchy Part 3 book that we talked about in that discussion there. So, this incited a couple of, interesting discussions and questions from the audience. And my question was, what does it mean for believing members if they have to sell the temples? I did say I would much prefer, on a personal level, I would much prefer that they just, sell off the land, or they convert it to homeless shelters or something. They even have a pool in the basement and a bunch of showers, so it would be really convenient to do that. But what will probably happen is the church is going to have to sell the temple, sell the churches that they have there, and then eventually whoever buys the land is going to demolish those. So what the implications are, we might see a YouTube video of a temple demolition. Now, that's just crazy to think about, right? But, if they have 16 chapels and 1 temple that are going to be underwater, and they sell them to somebody isn't going to want to use those buildings. They're going to want to demolish them and build their own buildings there, put in strip malls or whatever, which arguably provide more functionality and, contribute more to the economy than a temple does. But that still requires that a temple is going to have a wrecking ball smashed through it, or, be demolished through, charges like any large building is in any urban environment. So it's quite interesting to think about the implications of what would happen if the church decided to liquidate all of its assets in Florida. So that was the very first presentation that I attended at the entire symposium. And, D. Michael Quinn was the respondent there, and Mark Thomas was the person that was actually presenting all of the research there. And I have to say, it was just endlessly fascinating. A really, really good discussion, a great way to kick off the entire symposium. So after that, I went into a stats presentation, a statistical presentation by a guy named Benjamin Knoll, and he basically trotted out what is the numbers across a 1,000 person large survey that was conducted by, I believe it was Pew Research. ex-Mormons and seeing what their political leanings are, seeing what their age groups are, and seeing what their level of belief is, basically. It came down to a simple question of, do you believe in the church wholeheartedly, or do you think that there are problems in the church? That was the main question that they had to answer. And fascinating enough, I'd like to get this guy on the podcast at some point to, trot out his numbers to you guys, the listeners, because it was a huge presentation and it required a lot of graphs, and it was really fascinating to see the exact information, the implication of the information that he was presenting. So, that was the second presentation I went to at Sunstone, and it was just fantastic, absolutely amazing. So the third presentation was Mama Dragons, which we'll talk about that in maybe an upcoming podcast. That was really good. Then there was a black and white thinking presentation that was discussing, some issues in the church, whether we should treat them with black and white perspective, or we should treat them with some more nuance. That was a really good presentation with Dan Wotherspoon, John Hatch, and Jody Hansen. Just really, really good stuff. The next interview that I'm going to play for you guys actually was the presentation I went to after that one, and it was a presentation about Martin Harris given by H. Michael Marquardt. Now, I hope some of you have heard me cite The Rise of Mormonism in the podcast, because that is a chronological timeline book that H. Michael Marquardt wrote, and I love to use it as one of my sources. He does a fantastic job of constructing the timeline, the actual timeline of the rise of Mormonism. Basically, it's a time frame from 1816 to 1844. Really fantastic book, and it's highly recommended. So be sure to check out the show notes for H. Michael Marquardt and The Rise of Mormonism. There's an Amazon link to pick up his book, and also his website, which is Mormon Central, which is user.xmission.com, Research Central. That's where he posts all of his work online, and it's just an endless wealth of scholarship from a guy that has been, deep in the trenches of Mormon historianship for decades now. So, without further ado, this is H. Michael Marquardt. All right, I am sitting here with H. Michael Marquardt, and if anybody isn't familiar with his work, he's a very, very prolific writer. In one of his books titled The Rise of Mormonism, any listeners of this show know I frequently cite it as one of my sources to help out with the chronology of Mormonism from 1816 to 1844. I think that's even in the title of it, if I'm not mistaken. Your work is so well cited, and it seems like half of your book, half of each page is the footnotes of whatever you're discussing at the time. So, I just, right at the onset, I want to thank you for your work and for the historianship that you have done, Mike. It's
well, thank you for the comments. Yeah, the whole idea on the rise of Mormonism was actually present in brief form for a reader who may not know anything. Mm-hmm. Mostly chronological, sometimes topics, early history.
Mm-hmm. And what I find you tend to do is, each chapter has a basic, a topic that it covers, whether it's a certain spans of time, whether it's a 1 or 2 year period, or if it's a topic that tends to overflow into other, later dates. You tend to focus on that one topic until it's basically completely exhausted. And then the next chapter, you go back and pick up wherever you left off in the timeline and then continue from there. And from my own perspective, from, a storyteller, and, I learn stories chronologically so much better. That is so, so helpful in helping me understand it. And not just read it, but understand what I'm reading. So your method of writing is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, by doing it chronological, it really helps not only me as a writer, but I always think of the reader. And whether it's a reader, or if they have ebook, or if they have anything else, is the audience and what they want. And it's also essential to me to have the notes at the bottom of the page
for further reading, so they know where to find more information.
Yeah, if it quotes something, then you actually know where it comes from.
Yeah, that's I mean, and obviously it's peer-reviewed historianship. And it's very important, and it's presented in a very palpable form. It's very tangible. It's very easy to understand. So kind of why I have you sitting down here is you did a presentation on Martin Harris today, and I stood up, or I during the question and answer section, I said, I took 6 pages of notes, and I have even more questions than I do notes, and I want to get to some of those questions because your presentation was just lightning fast. Even though, you may have been presenting it at a slow pace, I found myself writing a note and then you were already on to the next thing. And I'm like, oh, I need to ask you more about that. So give us kind of a little bit of a synopsis of your presentation and exactly what it entailed.
Well, the title of the presentation was By the Power of the Spirit, Martin Harris in the Mormon Movement. And I try to first give a brief introduction of Martin being a church member and also being in 1834 a member of the Church High Council. Mm-hmm. He eventually, in 1837, was excommunicated from the church.
And tell me a little bit more about that, because I know in 1838, that was when the vast majority of, almost a purging of a lot of the leadership happened with the Kirtland Safety Society collapse and everything that was going on then. So, but he wasn't necessarily involved so much in that, from what I gather.
But soon after he was excommunicated at the end of December 1837, he helped incorporate and was one of the trustees of the Church of Christ. Mm-hmm. And with him was Joseph Coe and Cyrus Smalling. Okay. And then a couple of years later, he was back in the church, and he's listed as high priest in 1841. We know for certain he was rebaptized in 1842. So that's where he comes back into the church. But remember, he's in Ohio. And the church is in Nauvoo.
Which is remarkable because the vast majority of the Mormons had been chased out of Ohio by this point. Is that correct?
There was a small number of individuals, church members in Kirkland also.
Really?
Yeah, okay. They even have a revival there. And there was Hammond Babbitt who, in section 124 of the LDS Doctrine and Covenants, it mentions that he was basically called on the carpet for trying to have people gather to Kirkland, and that's what he was doing. He was telling people, "Well, come to Kirkland," and of course, the leadership of the church was in Nauvoo, and so of course, converts from England would go to Nauvoo. Okay. And so Harris never made it to Nauvoo. He stayed in Kirkland. Mm-hmm.
And that's where eventually after the death of Joseph Smith, he was no longer a member of the LDS Church that it was called at that time.
All we know is that he joined up with the Shakers and believed in the Holy Roll.
What was her name? Ellen? No. What was the name of the woman that the Shaker? Mother Ann Lee. That's what I wanted to talk to you. Tell me about her, because I've never heard that name before. I want a little more information on her.
Well, I only briefly mentioned her, but she was a founder in the 18th century, so in the 1700s of the Shaker movement. Okay. And they believe in heaven, that Christ was going to come. They believe in spiritual manifestations.
And literally shaking from the spirit, right? That's how they got their name.
In the United States, there was a book published briefly called A Holy and Sacred and Divine Roll. Okay. And that had a lot of published experiences of different Shakers. Okay. From there, Martin Harris, we know from different sources, said that he had a strong testimony, even stronger than the Book of Mormon, that his Shaker roll was divine and everything. And
That's amazing. Okay, so let's take this as a jumping off point, because Martin Harris, I think I even asked this in one of my many questions in your presentation, but he was very zealous. He seemed to do everything full bore. He never held back when it came to his ritualism or his spirituality. Tell me a little bit about how that kind of played into him being a member of so many different sects and, radically believing in those sects while he was a member of them, and then rapidly flopping to another sect.
Yeah, well, he was, I term him as like a spiritual gypsy. He's looking for something, he wants to be important there. He was a member in the early church as a high counselor, but he was removed from that position, and so he, as a early member of the church, he was actually baptized on April 6, 1830.
Yeah, with the founding day of the church.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so he would be really excited about these different things. Someone else had a spiritual experience, and so he's on this one on the Shakers. That was going on probably for a few years.
Wow.
And then when after Joseph's death, then James J. Strang, he claimed to have gold plates. He claimed to have an angel come, and Martin Harris was involved with him, became a high counselor in Strang's high council in the same place, Kirkland, Ohio. They always met in the Kirkland Temple, and Harris's brother Preserved and Oliver Cowdery's father, William Cowdery, they were members of the High Council. So he was deeply involved there. And then they decided to have a mission to go over to England, because there's a lot of converts still over there, mainly in control by the apostles, because they did the missionary work in the early 1837 to the early 1840s, a lot of converts, and some of them, of course, came to Nauvoo.
One thing I wrote in my notes there, when he went to England, because so many people had kind of associated this is what I took from your talk anyway, please correct me if I'm wrong here. So many people associated the Strangites as being part of those crazy Mormons over there, that when he got to England, the public outrage and opposition was so drastic against him that he actually denied being a member of the Strangites. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It was usually Martin Harris. What got him in trouble was usually his mouth. He just kept on going because he's always correct. And so on the Strang deal, there was an article in the Latter-day Saint Millennial Star telling when Strang presented his claims locally. I think it was in Michigan. And they were not accepted. But the publication of that probably put a little damper on the church members.
I'm sure.
And when they had other editorials in the paper, they weren't even worrying about trying to talk to him. They figured that whatever he said would probably do him in.
And I think that was so beautifully encapsulated when you said Strang said after he came back from England, I think this was a direct quote, the greatest blunder I ever made was sending Martin to England, right?
Well, that was said by his missionary companion.
Oh, the companion, not by Strang himself. That's even more remarkable.
His companion wrote to Strang. And trying to get the wording here, he really wrote, and it was pretty embarrassing because of a mission. At the most, was probably be 2.5 months of a mission that Harris was planning for at least a year. He had turned over his property, power of attorney, to his brother. And expected to be gone.
Okay, so then let's pick up in 1847. when he joined the Church of Christ. Is that correct? That was being led by David Whitmer?
Well, the church was started by William E. McLellin, and he was supporting David Whitmer as a successor.
Oh, okay.
Now, McLellin had joined Sidney Rigdon's church. He moved from a church that he thought was and confirmed to be true to another group. He was a spiritual gypsy, too.
Oh, no kidding.
And so McLellin, he also was associated briefly with Strang, and actually later had a debate with him. But he
Really?
would be someone who would say, "Oh, you know what? I remember when Joseph Smith ordained David Whitmer successor in 1834." And so he got Martin Harris. Yeah, I remember that too. And Martin Harris signed a testimony of 3 witnesses to the effect that David Whitmer was ordained by Joseph Smith in July 1834.
Was that? It seems like that was. How I understood this was that was when Joseph took Zion's camp out, and he basically appointed David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery to run the church in his place. That's how I interpret what that 1834 ordination of David Whitmer was. Is that the same thing?
Well, basically, it was at the end of Zion's camp.
Okay.
Which is the camp of Israel that was supposed to redeem the land in Jackson County.
Right. And they just kind of gave up, when they were on their way there.
They got a revelation that their efforts were, received in fellowship.
Okay.
And so, at that moment, just in case something happens, when Joseph Smith would be going back to Ohio, something happens, who's going to be the successor? So he ordained at that moment David Whitmer.
So was that the same thing that David Whitmer was using from Martin Harris, that same ordination that they were saying, oh, well, David Whitmer is the rightful successor?
Yeah, we remember that ordination.
Wow.
And later David Whitmer even uses his same ordination. But it was an interesting time, because later, at the end of 1834, is when Oliver Cowdery became the assistant president, which means basically back to being the second elder of the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back to demoted once again, right?
Well, he was actually promoted.
Oh, promoted.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that may indicate that prior ordination was short-lived.
Yeah.
But they still, those who remembered, thought highly of that.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's. In 1851, he became a follower of Bishop. What was Bishop's first name?
Francis Gladden Bishop.
Francis Gladden Bishop.
Yeah, he had been a early missionary, and I believe he was excommunicated. But he claimed to have visitations. He claimed to have the Book of Mormon artifacts, and he gave them the most detailed description in Mormonism of gold plates, the breastplate, the helmet of Moroni, the sword of Laban.
That's remarkable.
He said he had it all.
Was he? I'm trying to understand this from a naturalistic perspective. Okay, I'm kind of a realist when it comes to this, and possibly a little bit pessimistic. Tell me how, if there's any historical basis to this, is it anywhere near possible that Martin Harris had the plates with him as part of the deal, whatever plates Joseph Smith had, whether it was a manufactured set or whatever the case may have been. Do you think that Martin Harris had the plates with him in a chest? Because I know there's the 1836 or maybe 1834 Charles Anthon letter where he says Martin Harris came back to me trying to sell me the plates in a chest, and when I asked to see the chest or see the plates, he said, if you open it, you'll die, basically, right?
Not that not that Martin Harris had any plates, but when he went to Charles Anton in New York City, he told him the early story of getting the gold plates, and Anton told him, "Well, this thing sounds like a hoax to me."
Yeah, that was
Anton never said who that individual was, but we know it was Martin Harris.
Okay,
But after the Book of Mormon was published, then he went back and to try to give him a copy.
Yeah,
but I don't think he took a copy. But Anton never mentions his name, and I think at one point he thought he was Joseph Smith.
Really?
Which is incorrect, yeah.
Because I was, from the way that I interpreted Anthon's letters was he was, it seemed almost like Martin Harris was coming along trying to sell the actual plates to him. He had them in a chest, and then when Anthon asked if I can see the plates, Martin Harris said, "I can allow you to peer in there, but, God will...
Well, that's what he repeats that Joseph Smith told him. Mm-hmm. He repeats that he's thinking of putting up his farm for the publication.
Okay.
And of course, soon after that, he was one of the scribes for the early manuscript of the Book of Mormon. Okay. But eventually, that was lost.
Yeah, that was the first meeting with Anthon, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I guess I'm confused about the second meeting then. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I guess there really isn't much historical veracity to maybe thinking part of the deal of Martin Harris financing the Book of Mormon was that Martin Harris would get the plates that were, whatever Joseph had in the glass box. That's what Martin Harris, got out of the deal. Basically, that's the way I see it.
Martin Harris was a real good farmer, businessman. He just believes in different things when it gets to religious ideas. And he was looking for making a lot of money because the Book of Mormon, to get it printed and bound, cost about 60 cents a copy.
Right.
And they were originally going to sell it for $1.75.
Ooh, that's a good return on investment.
But that was a lot of money for a worker. And so they eventually dropped the price to $1.25. So that's just like the stock market. He just lost 50 cents a copy.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. And I mean, Martin Harris he was a wealthy farmer. He had a very valuable plot of land, but he didn't exactly have like the liquid assets to pay for this huge drop in the value at the time. Right.
So therefore, if he didn't have the money that you get from the sales, then you'd have to sell his farm for the $3,000 to
finance it.
Finance the Book of Mormon.
Which he eventually had to do, right? And I think that, you saying that he was a businessman is played out with, I believe it was Lucy Harris's affidavit that says, when we were arguing about it, he said, if you would leave me to it, I would make money of it, or something to that effect, right?
He was interested in making that money if he's going to put up his farm for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And he obviously had some sort of idea that he would have made money back, or else he probably wouldn't have gone in on business on it.
Right.
Whether he had a vision or not, it didn't seem to matter much.
Even at $1.25 a copy, you still make money. But some of the missionaries gave away copies. Some of them used it for a number of years as barter. Just, I'll give you a copy for something that you'll give me.
Or a sack of flour or something, maybe.
Well, I was going to mention that it was Lester Brooks who wrote to James Strang, and he said, Martin Harris, I learned, is at Kirkland doing all he can against you. The greatest blunder that I ever committed was in taking Harris to England.
That's the quote.
So it was basically Martin Harris just blabbering about being a witness, blabbering against the 12 apostles. He opened his mouth and that was it. He couldn't shut him up. It's all like when he got to Painesville, he talked all about everything.
Right.
Angels, gold plates, spirits.
And I think probably the most beautiful thing out of your entire presentation is what you opened with. You said in 1818, he claimed that he was inspired to not join any church.
Right.
I think that's so remarkably ironic and just, serendipitous of what his life became after that, of how tightly affiliated he was with Mormonism and every break-off of Mormonism after that.
Yeah, he was involved, especially in Kirkland, because that's where he was. He wanted to make sure there was no other name. And he one time said, that name at Latter-day Saints should be Latter-day Devils. And then they changed the heading on the front of the Kirkland Temple from the Church of the Latter-day Saints, built AD 1834, to Church of Christ.
So that's how they got the name Church of Christ that they've been using until they reformed.
He's still doing that idea there.
Okay.
And that's when a lot of people visiting Kirkland and signing the roster would have met Martin Harris. And later, Edward Stevenson, the LDS missionary, met him and eventually got a subscription and brought Harris to Utah Territory. Mm-hmm. And he talked in the tabernacle, he talked at General Conference, got rebaptized, got his endowment. And I think the main deal I was trying to bring out is that in all Martin Harris experiences, he never denied any of his testimonies.
That was one question that came up that didn't even occur to me, and I'm so glad that somebody asked. In the audience, they said, if he did so many of these, he followed so many different religions, he eventually came back to Utah and died here in Utah, why is it that we can rely on him as a legitimate witness for the Book of Mormon and the plates? I mean, even he himself said, I never saw them with the natural eye the way I see that napkin over there or something to that effect. I see it the way that you see a city through a mountain.
Yeah,
am I mistaken on that?
Well, that was in about March 1838. He said that. That's when some of the Kirkland dissenters believed the Book of Mormon like Martin Harris did. Mm-hmm. But there was other ones who gave that Book of Mormon up. And Harris was trying, and this is in the same Church of Christ, he was trying to bring them together, and he said in the public meeting that he never saw the place except in vision or imagination. And
with his second sight, right?
You could see us like a city through a mountain. So even though the city's beyond the mountain, with second sight you'll be able to see it. And according to LDS Doctrine and Covenants, section 17, the three witnesses were promised to see the plates, through faith. So
I think that's probably the most indicative part of all of it. So how can we rely on that testimony as saying that the Book of Mormon is true if or that the plates were a legitimate physically manifest thing? Yeah, how can we rely on Martin Harris at all?
Well, there's in the original first edition, 1830 Book of Mormon, the testimonies were at the end of the book.
Yes.
Yeah. These are, if you look at them carefully, they're not notarized, they're not dated, no location. They're religious testimonies.
And they're a signed statement. It's not each of them wrote their own statement. It's a statement that was written for them and they signed.
Right. And those statements are just religious statements saying, in essence, that Joseph Smith had some plates. Mm-hmm. Now, other scholars and members look at that and wonder whether the plates were ever used, and that's another issue, whether the plates were used in the dictation process.
And I think a lot of historians would argue that they never were, and I kind of tend to side with those historians.
Yeah, some of the top scholars indicate that the plates were at another location. It could be under cloth in a room, it could be in the woods.
In the woods, yeah. Buried, or dug under the hearth.
And then recently, there've been a lot of ideas about this stone called a seer stone, that he needed that. and he had to put that in a hat. But if that's the case, then the question is, where is the gold plates? But that's a religious question, not a historical question.
Not a historical question.
We can't say that Harris didn't have an experience. I think that he had an experience, a visionary experience by the eye of faith. Yeah. And it's just like the other experiences, like in the Kirkland Temple, April 3rd, 1836, it says, the eyes of our understanding were open, and they had a visionary experience.
I have my own opinions about that.
They mentioned some personages who appeared to them, and that's their religious experience. We don't want to take anything away from that.
Yeah. But we have to understand it and examine it in the context that it deserves.
Right.
And I think I agree with you. I believe that he did have some sort of religious experience, much in the way that he had a religious experience of, Jesus in the form of a deer walking through the woods with him, and he spoke with the deer for a while. I think they're all in the same vein.
Yeah, the thing is, it's a mindset of these people.
Yes.
And
we can't understand it.
Yeah, because even Section 76, when it's with Sidney Rigdon, they have visionary experience, celestial, terrestrial, and telestial kingdoms. That's where we get those names from. Mm-hmm. And the text mentions that through their understanding, that's what they saw.
Yeah, through the eyes of the understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually, this is probably a whole other tangent that we can't spend any time on, but I actually think that there was something to do with the anointing oil that they were using at the time that may have influenced what they were seeing. But that's my own.
They did. There was some experiences in the Kirkland Temple, but
after the people had been fasting and then imbibing freely on the sacramental wine and being anointed with some special oil, and there's definitely some interesting stuff there. I don't want to take up any more of your time, Mike, but I want to thank you for your presentation and for sitting down and talking with me. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for asking, and I hope the audience is enjoy this and be fair-minded. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the history, and I think the Latter-day Saint history is really very fascinating.
Yeah.
And a lot of the documents, as I mentioned, are available at the Church History Library catalog.
Mm-hmm. And through the Joseph Smith papers.
Joseph Smith papers are presenting stuff.
Okay. And actually, one of my favorite sources is the Encyclopedia of Mormonism and the Book of Abraham Project, all hosted on BYU. They have so amazing scholarship there and a lot of first-hand accounts and autobiographies. I love that. I love the first-hand accounts. I rely on them. So, Mike, thank you so very much. I look forward to speaking with you later.
Okay.
All right, and that was my discussion with H. Michael Marquardt. It went a little bit longer than I expected, but Martin Harris is just such a fantastically interesting individual. We love good old not so smarty Marty in our timeline. He's just quite the wild card when it came to shit going down in the church. I love Martin Harris, and the presentation that Mike gave was way, way better than the discussion that he and I had. He just basically constructed the chronology of Martin Harris all the way from 1818. That was the first thing he said. He was inspired not to join any church all the way until 1860 something when he died. I mean, died in Salt Lake. So, Martin Harris, just somebody, 1875, that's when he died in Utah. So, there's just so much interesting stuff when it comes to Martin Harris. I had only researched him up to the point that we're at in the historical timeline, 1837. So much of what he talked about, I had no idea about. And it was interesting to see the interminglings of the various churches that emerged from the succession crisis and how Martin Harris kind of it bounced around so many of those. And then, even back to the Shakers, shaking Quakers, whatever you want to call them, the Quakers with Mother Ann Lee. There's just so much interesting information about Martin Harris, and H. Michael Marquardt really did a fantastic job of just relaying all that. It was great. So moving on from there, one of the next presentations I went to, of course, these aren't exactly the order that I did them in, and I didn't take notes at every one of the presentations I went to. But there was a guy named Bill Spear that did a Bayesian analysis of the evolution of the Doctrine and Covenants. And it was just looking at the evolution of it as it has been changed throughout the years from the original writings. So he took all of the handwritten original revelations that were included in the Book of Commandments and in the Millennial Star and all of the church publications that would later be included in the Doctrine and Covenants. And then he referenced those against multiple versions of the Doctrine and Covenants to see how much they were changed as the years progressed. Now, it was fascinating to watch, don't get me wrong, but Bill Spear is at very early stages of this actual presentation and, compiling this research. And there's so many other implications to his research that he didn't incorporate in his presentation that I really hope eventually he'll get around to. One of them was authorship attributions. I really wanted to see how he incorporated authorship of the different sections in the Book of Covenants and see how they changed. So, like Doctrine and Covenants section 20, right? We know for a fact that was written by Oliver Cowdery. A bunch of the other revelations were written by Sidney Rigdon, and the majority of them were written by Joseph Smith, right? So we can identify each of those sections, whether they were written by Joseph, Oliver, or Sidney Rigdon. And I was curious, I asked him this when he was presenting, maybe they have changed some authors more than others. Like maybe, say, Joseph Smith's revelations haven't been changed very much, but if you reflect that against Doctrine and Covenants section 20 or 72 that Oliver Cowdery or Sidney Rigdon wrote, maybe they changed those more than they had changed Joseph Smith's revelations. Or something to that effect. Of course, that's a really hard to determine question, and it requires a lot more augmenting to his statistical analysis here. But afterwards, after he was done with his presentation, I also went up and asked him, hey, have you incorporated any of the Rigdonite revelations into your studying here? See if they, alter your data at all. And he didn't even realize that Sidney Rigdon, once, the succession crisis happened, he didn't even realize that Sidney Rigdon broke off and made his own religious sect and continued coming up with revelations. So I discussed that with him for a little while. We exchanged information, and maybe we'll go from there. Maybe he'll come on the podcast someday, but that was just a fantastic presentation by Bill Spear. I think he does have a video up online. It was maybe an ex-Mormon Foundation presentation. It might have been at one of the other Sunstones, but he's really doing a lot of fantastic work, and it's all backed up just by the sheer numbers and statistics that he can find with these statistical and Bayesian analyses. It's really great stuff. So, I enjoyed that one quite a bit. The next presentation I went to was, was there an original church, basically, by Denver Snuffer. People call Denver Snuffer's work basically its own Mormonism. People say that if they agree with Snuffer, they call themselves Snufferites, basically, because he has a very amorphous, weird version of Mormonism that he believes in. And, I had, I took 3.5 pages of notes, and I disagreed with quite a lot of what he said. But he did talk about, what's interesting to try and distill out of the earliest writings in the church and see what Joseph meant by them. And he had a very odd method of doing so. He was basically trying to figure out the church before it was founded, because he thinks that the 1830, when the church was founded, that was kind of when things started going downhill, which, I can almost agree with him. So he was trying to figure out what was meant in the Book of Mormon before the actual church started in 1830, what was meant by the angels appearing to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and giving them the priesthood. And, needless to say, it's a really, really weird. But, he has his own beliefs. He does a lot of writing online, and he probably has a couple of books out there. But Denver Snuffer, fascinating individual, and it was quite an interesting presentation to listen to. And I couldn't help but get up and ask a couple of questions, which was the best part about all of these. I mean, there was it was an open point of inquiry. Every single person did their presentation, and then they opened up the next, however long until their time frame was up for more questions. And that was the best part. And that actually was played out really well in one of the next ones that I went to. It was, the title of it was Heresy Does Not Equal Apostasy. And I can't remember the name of that guy that gave it. Let me find it here. Here it is. It's called Heretics Are Not Apostates, a Social Conflict Theory Approach to Mutually Dissing Our Fellows. It was presented by Charles Randall Paul, and I'll read his credentials here. He has a PhD in social thought from the University of Chicago and is the founder and president of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. And this is the abstract of it, and hopefully you guys can tell me what you think here. Basically, he was drawing a line between heretics and apostates, which I agree there is a line, but I didn't agree with how he drew the line. But this is the abstract of his presentation. In The Heretical Imperative, sociologist Peter Berger defangs the term heretic, helping us see the forces that produce heretics as natural and inevitable. No group, once formed, remains pure. Some members of that group will notice the changes and suggest ways in which the group has lost its original purity and how to get it back. Is there a limit to heresy before it becomes apostasy? If so, what are the boundaries that separate loyal dissenters and outsiders' enemy? How can we understand the dynamics of our dissents? So, needless to say, I had some issues with what he presented. Here are some of the notes that I wrote on this. And this is something that he actually said, and this is that, religion does not offer any testable claims, basically. And the entire premise of his presentation was people become heretics, but not every heretic goes as far to getting to the point of apostasy. And he kept painting the word apostasy with so much vitriol and hatred almost that it bothered me. So when it came down to the actual discussion portion or the question and answer session, I had to apologize to everybody because there were a few questions out there. One person got up before me, but as soon as I got up there, I couldn't stop asking him more and more questions and having an actual a discussion, almost a debate with this guy. But the first thing I said when I got up there was, you go to any atheist conference, you'll see that religion, science flies people into to the moon, and religion flies people into buildings. And I said that's a tired old trope, and that's something that like you said, religion doesn't offer testable claims. And he kept making appeals to philosophy. He kept saying philosophy are basically the seeds of all thought, and I said, yeah, that's absolutely right. But the fact that religion, it doesn't really take any philosophy and make it any better. Religion oftentimes colors philosophy. That kind of creates a problem. I went on to say, I've been labeled with heretic and apostate. I was wearing a Naked Mormonism t-shirt. I've been labeled with both of them, and I think they're both awesome and useful words. I said a heretic is somebody that is speaking out against, any given fundamental theory of thought or ideology, right? Somebody that is a heretic has something to say, and you shouldn't judge them as a heretic and write off what they're going to say just because they are a heretic. You should judge what they say based on the merits of what they're saying and the evidence that they produce. A heretic can oftentimes come up with really good information or a new theory on something, right? Einstein's theory of relativity was heretical to the Newtonian theory of planetary orbit. So, that's one example of where heresy actually gets us closer to the truth, right? Science is nothing but heretics trying to disprove other people that are, purporting the status quo, or that are claiming the status quo of the scientific body. So I said, heresy is a very useful word. And also the word apostate, I don't think you should try and paint people as apostate when they don't deserve the word, right? An apostate, if you look at the Latin definition of apostate, it's apostata, right? That means to punish. But if you look at the Greek definition, apostes, of course I butchered both of those words. If you look at the Greek definition, it means a runaway slave. A slave that is broken from his chains of bondage and has run away. And I think that's a very useful definition for apostate, especially when somebody has broken free from their religion or from whatever. So, you tell me, what's better, to be labeled as a heretic or an apostate, or both, right? I think that both of them are great labels to use. And beyond that, he kept saying that Satan went, he began as a heretic in the war in heaven, and then he became apostate when he was driven into hell. And I said, by the sheer definition of apostate, being a freed slave, Satan is entombed in hell. He's trapped in hell. He can't get out of hell. So that's not being freed from bondage. That's being left in bondage of eternal punishment for coming up with heresy or for being a heretic, right? And I see that as a extremely immoral and a disgusting practice that, no God could ever, honestly do. I didn't say that in my discussion portion or in the question and answer session, but, these are almost my musings right now. It seems like if a God is considered all-powerful and can do anything that he, she, it wants, is not threatened by a heretic, right? If, I think it was maybe Heber J. Grant said this, if we have the truth, then it cannot be harmed. If we have not the truth, then it ought to be harmed. So if God is the center of truth and the dictator of all of the rules of the universe, then no amount of truth could ever threaten this God, right? But if it's not the truth, then it ought to be harmed. So did Satan have some level of knowledge or intellect that harmed God, that forced God to throw him into hell for eternity? Or what was kind of what was the reasoning behind that? Could God just not control this Satan person? Could God not control his own creation? So, these are kind of, a mix of what I asked him during the question and answer session and my own thoughts right now. It was a really kind of confusing and frustrating presentation, but I feel like we had a really good discussion, a good back and forth up there once I stood up during the Q&A session. And, even afterwards, he came up and talked to me when I was somewhere else after another presentation and said, hey, thanks for the back and forth. And I said, no, thank you for being open and honest and actually having a discussion and, defending your position, because that's important. You can't propose something unless you're able to defend it. So, I gave him a card. Hopefully I'll be in contact with him again. He's a fascinating guy, to say the least, and, I really enjoyed having that discussion. So, moving on here. Oh, yeah, the next one, this was on the second day, the end of the second day. And it was 4 views on the Book of Mormon, and it was a panel of 4 people that discussed the 4 opposing views of the Book of Mormon. And my God, it was so fascinating, so interesting to listen to the people, claim their own version of the Book of Mormon, right? Let me find where it is here. Here it is. All right, so we had Brant Gardner, who was somebody that was defending the literal, historical Book of Mormon, saying that it was indeed written by ancient prophets of old, and he was trying to put out the claims of a Pan-American model for the Nephites and Lamanites, and that was really interesting. I thought his points fell apart when the other people were able to present, but when he was standing up there and preaching his own point, things did make a little bit of sense. I didn't agree with the majority of it, but as soon as it came under any scrutiny of the next presenters, it just completely fell apart. The next person that presented, of course, was Sandra Tanner of the Utah Lighthouse Ministries. Now, the Tanners have been involved in so much of Mormon scholarship since like the 60s or something. Sandra and Gerald Tanner have spearheaded so much Mormon historianship and scholarship that there's truly no way to quantify all of their work. Now, I have to say right now, I did have a discussion with Sandra Tanner. We sat down and talked for, I think it was like 40 minutes. But that's going to come in the next special edition episode, because it was so awesome to talk to her about one topic alone. I'm not going to divulge on what that topic is. You're going to have to wait for 2 weeks to get to that episode. Of course, next week is going to be a historical episode, but the following week after that, I don't think I'll do a special edition. I think it's going to be just a good old clean cut episode on what Sandra and I talked about, because she's just such a fascinating individual as she presents her information in a very good way, very tangible and palpable perspective of Mormon history. And I'll discuss her work in a couple of weeks when we get to that. But she got up and said, here are 3 sources, basically, that we know Joseph Smith had access to that he very possibly used for plagiarizing the Book of Mormon. And one of them was, the King James Version of the Bible, of course. And then the second source was the introduction for the King James Version of the Bible, which is, very, very important that's something that's only in the King James. And it's, in that preface, it's only in the King James, and it's included in today's version that Mormons have as part of their quad. So, that's important that we understand Joseph Smith had access to that. And then the third source she used was Westminster Confession, which that was basically a Presbyterian text that Joseph Smith would have had access to because his mother and his siblings, a few of his siblings, joined the Presbyterian Church in 1824, 25 or something. And there are phrases that are in that confession that are nowhere in the Bible that are found in the Book of Mormon. So, 3 sources that are really solid sources, possibly, that Joseph Smith definitely would have had access to, that, they're demonstrable plagiarisms, basically, that are included in the Book of Mormon. But she went on to kind of put a further nail in the coffin by saying, the church right now has proposed that they're, the seer stone, they have come to embrace the seer stone. And, there's that picture of Uchtdorf holding up his iPhone and basically saying, it kind of worked like an iPhone, and God just told Joseph what to write through, whatever information was coming through the stone. And she said, well, if that's the case, then any mess-ups that are in the Book of Mormon or any plagiarism that is in the Book of Mormon are God's, right? They're not Joseph Smith. They're from God. They're God's mistakes or whatever. So she kind of nailed it down and, showed these 3 sources that Joseph definitely had access to. And, she just did a completely knockdown, drag-out presentation. She did a great job. The next person that presented was David Bokovoy, and he's a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near East and has an MA in Jewish Studies, both from Brandeis University. He did a really good job. He just kind of said that, Joseph Smith was inspired by God to write what he did, but the Book of Mormon itself didn't come from God. Joseph Smith was just a charismatic leader, almost a philosopher, basically. He believes in Mormonism, but his own view of Mormonism, so, I could take that or leave it, but he still had a fair amount of information in his presentation that was quite nuanced view of the Book of Mormon. And right when he got up, he said, I guess I'm kind of the peacemaker on the stage because I agree with everybody but Brandt, who was arguing that it's a literal history, an ancient history. But he agrees with Mark, Sandra, and Mark and Sandra saying that it was inspired, saying that that Joseph was kind of inspired, but that it's not actually a historical text. So he was kind of the middle of the road guy. And then Mark Thomas, who presented the first presentation that I discussed about Mormon money and the climate change problems with the assets that the church has in Florida. He was also part of this panel, and he's a believer in the Mormon Church and the Book of Mormon, but he believes that Joseph Smith was basically a philosopher inspired by God and wrote the Book of Mormon for himself. But what Mark Thomas did was amazing, absolutely amazing, because he spoke with a couple of people from Vermont and studying 19th century, 18th and 19th century American history in the New England area, and he learned basically how to speak the way that Joseph Smith would have spoke. And he said that, we need to treat the Book of Mormon as a piece of art. It's literary genius, basically. And he read some passages in the way that Joseph Smith would have spoken. And it was beautiful. It really, really was quite beautiful. The way that he read it from the 1830 Book of Mormon, not the current version, and he said it just the way that Joseph Smith would have said it with, kind of ignoring the R's and the long vowels and, kind of speaking like a backwoods country New Englander. of the 19th century. And I have to say, I agree with Mark Thomas the most, saying that, the Book of Mormon is a work of literature. I don't think Joseph Smith was fully responsible for it, but whoever did write it, it is art in and of itself. It may be boring at times, but there are things in there, philosophies and, beautiful passages that we can look at and say, there's something to learn from this. There's something beautiful. There's something we can philosophically distill from this that is, beautiful just stand alone. So, Mark Thomas did an amazing presentation. He's a believer in the church and in Joseph Smith, but he does posit a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon, saying it was inspired by God, but Joseph Smith himself wrote it. So, that was probably one of the best presentations out of all of them that I saw. Just this panel discussion of 4 people discussing the origins of the Book of Mormon, and God, it was really amazing. Oh yeah, and the moderator for it was a guy named Chris Smith, who's a budding Mormon historian. Hopefully, we'll get him on the show eventually too. He's done some other podcasts, and he's done a lot of good scholarship. He understands Mormonism quite well. If I'm not mistaken, he was never Mormon at all, and he's just studying it just because it's so fascinating, and that's what he's getting his master's or maybe his doctorate in history of. So, yeah, really, really good stuff. Let's see, what do we have here? Okay, yeah, the last presentation that I took notes on was basically Mormonism and magic. Let me find it here. Yeah, here we go. Mormon Magic and the Religious Worldview. There were 3 presenters. We had Alan Hansen, Michael Reed, and Cheryl Bruno. So the presentation started out with Alan Hansen. Basically, he is a Hebrew scholar and historian, and he discussed some of the Israelite and Hebrew magical practices and rituals and how they've evolved throughout time. And then he took them from Old Testament times and basically led them up to about the 15 or 1600s. And then it was Cheryl Bruno's turn. She got up and she took it from, the early 1600s up to Joseph's time, discussing the influences of, Nathaniel Wood and who are some of the other people. There's so much here. So many notes. I don't even know. Johannes Kelpius, through Masonry, how Masonry was alchemical at its very foundation, and she talked a lot about alchemy and being basically the early version of chemistry, the way that astrology was the early version of astronomy today. So it was a really amazing presentation. And then third was Michael Reed. Michael Reed got up, and I was able to stick around for 10 minutes of his presentation, and then I had to leave in order to go volunteer for the banquet dinner. And the banquet dinner was great. There was a presentation of Tyler Glenn, who did the recent music video Trash, and basically, he spit on Joseph Smith's portrait, and, it's this big controversial thing because he's been, kind of the poster boy of Mormonism and homosexuality being, going hand in hand just fine, and then he came out with this Trash video, and he just slammed the shit out of the church, and it was just really good. But he got up and, he did a 20 or 25 minute talk on his journey through Mormonism, all the way through his mission, feeling homosexual tendencies and not knowing what to do about them, and how he was saying, how he was living in direct conflict to the church, and the church was trying to tout him as, this famous guy that was, he's gay and Mormon, and so anybody that's gay can be Mormon too. It was kind of twisted how he kind of got railroaded by the church, basically, and then finally it all broke down for him, and then he released this video Trash. There will be a link to it in the show notes, Tyler Glenn's presentation, his music video, and then after that he played an acoustic version of Trash, and it was just amazing. It was really, really good. So be sure to check the show notes for that video if you haven't seen it. It made the rounds about a year ago, and a lot of people weren't sure how to react to it, and I don't know what else to say about it. It was very controversial, to say the least. But that was Tyler Glenn's video and his presentation. Oh, I totally forgot about this. I didn't take notes on that, so that's how I skipped over it. But there's one more recording that I had a discussion with somebody. The guy's name is John Hammond. He's the author of Island Adventures. And I say in his and mine discussion, I think Island Adventures is kind of a misnomer, because adventure is just not what happened. Basically, he gave a presentation on how the Mormon missionary force out to the Hawaiian Islands in 1852 and 53 were kind of responsible for the spreading of smallpox and, inadvertently killing hundreds of native Hawaiian Islanders. And, it's really twisted. It's really messed up. We talk a little bit about his book and some of the first-person accounts that he was using. He was using all kinds of first-person diaries and stuff. George Q. Cannon was one of the people that was heavily involved in it at the time. He was on the island working to translate the Book of Mormon into the native language. And there was, a small contingency of missionaries, and they were just going around to different islands and trying to proselyte to these people and bless them, and using oil and, rubbing the oil on their wounds. And then they would go and bless the next person, not washing their hands in between. And they just continued to infect more and more people. There was a loose quarantine put up by the Hawaiian government, and the missionaries just directly violated the quarantine, even knowing about it multiple times. And that further spread the disease even more. The people there believed that the Mormons could heal them, so oftentimes when they had medicine given to them by the actual doctors on the island, they were throwing that away and just saying, the missionaries they'll heal us. And the missionaries claimed that it was basically the scourge going through and killing the people that were unworthy. So it's really twisted. There were only like 8 people sitting in on that presentation, and I think it was one of the more fascinating presentations to listen to. John Hammond did just an amazing job of presenting it. So this is my quick discussion with him. At the beginning, there's somebody talking right next to us, and they're laughing, and it's really annoying. But they go away after a little while, and after the first couple minutes, the discussion is really clean audio after that. And John tells us all about his book and so much of what his presentation was about. So, without further ado, this is John Hammond, author of Island Adventures.
I'm here with John Hammond, and he just gave an amazing presentation about the Hawaii missionary force in 1853 and some of the problems they ran into. Thank you for taking a second to talk with me here, John.
You're welcome.
It was a fascinating discussion, and basically what I was able to take away from it was the missionaries were almost wholly responsible for a lot of deaths on various islands in Hawaii.
Well, I wouldn't say they were wholly responsible, because I think there were a lot of other people who violated the quarantine. The quarantine around Honolulu wasn't enforced by the authorities very well.
Okay.
And they should have been really stopping people. But they didn't. But the missionary, and so there were probably other natives who were fleeing the epidemic and running out into the villages, or just simply traveling,
and that was
get stopped.
That was spreading it in itself.
So it was getting spread by other people. I don't think it was the Mormons alone that spread it.
Okay, for sure. I mean, of course, they didn't have to be wholly responsible.
But the missionary effort was going on at the time, and they were going from Honolulu and going out to convert these people and baptize them.
And you said multiple times in your presentation, this person traveled to here, and they violated the quarantine.
I didn't even read half of what I could have read.
Half of the journals.
All the travels.
That's absolutely fascinating. So basically, it was just this huge outbreak of smallpox, and it seemed like a lot of the way that the missionaries understood it, and the church leaders at the time, George Q. Cannon, you said he was translating the Book of Mormon at the time. A lot of them seemed to interpret it as it was a scourge that was killing off the wicked, or the ones that were not.
Right before the second, they believed the second coming was imminent, nigh.
That's Zionism,
and that all this death and destruction was part of God's plan. They believe that very strongly.
And almost in sometimes it seemed like to the detriment of people, throwing out their meds that the actual doctors were giving them, so that the missionaries could come bless them with the anointing oil. And
Yeah,
and healed them supposedly, and arguably that was a even further cause of all of this, right?
Yes,
I mean
that's what I believe.
I mean, and it makes sense.
There's not been a lot of discussion about this. Historian Kenny, Scott Kenny, has written something about this, but otherwise, I've seen no discussion of it at all.
So fascinating. And I think it plays into this mindset that we can't put our minds there, right? We can't understand what it's like. I mean, in Zion's camp, there was an outbreak of cholera. It killed, some horrible number of saints.
One of them, my ancestor.
No kidding. Wow. Fascinating. But I mean, they were on a mission to redeem Zion, bring back independence and restore the members that had been chased out of Missouri back to their homes. They were on a holy mission from God, but still God saw it fit for some of them to die by cholera. Yeah, I find it fascinating, the parallels between the two and the lack of a scientific mindset that served to be a detriment there. So,
yeah, and they were burying the dead, the cholera dead next to a creek. With all the stuff going down, and then being, the people drank out of the streams.
Well, and you even said at one point that some of I think it was from one of the journals, that they went and they swam in one of the creeks to help relieve the sores. It's like that didn't really help either if they're washing open sores into the creek that people are drinking from. Yeah. I mean, it's appalling to think of it now, but it was just what had happened back then. That's just how it was. So, can you tell the listeners what your book is and kind of introduce that? Tell about it.
It's the it's called Island Adventures, and the subtitle is the mission. Let me see here. Yeah, the Hawaiian mission of Francis A. Hammond, 1851-1865. Frank Hammond was my great-great-grandfather.
Oh, okay.
And his and my great-great-grandmother, Mary Jane, was there on the mission, and she kept a journal part of the time as well.
Oh, wow.
So he kept 9 journals. Frank did during the years that he was there.
Wow.
And I did the first typescript, and that's the primary basis for the book, although it also includes journal entries from all the other missionaries and from some of the Protestant missionaries. And so
I got to pick up a copy of it. Island Adventures by John Hammond. Awesome. This is a little postcard.
It's got a little description on the back too.
Awesome. And I have to say, Island Adventures.
It also tells of when he came back the second time as the mission president. They were going to have another gathering place. He set up the first gathering place on Lanai in the mid-1850s, and it didn't work. It failed. But then when he came back, they set up another one on Oahu, and he purchased the land where BYU Hawaii, the Mormon Temple, and the Polynesian Culture Center, he purchased that land in 1865.
Oh, wow.
He took about $5,000 down payment from Brigham Young from Salt Lake and to buy that. He picked out the land and purchased it. So
amazing.
So it tells that story as well.
And I see. On my show, that's my favorite thing to do is cite autobiographies and first person journals and newspaper clippings, so you don't have to view it through like a pro Mormon or anti Mormon side. It's just what they recorded at the time. So you providing all of these first person accounts, that's invaluable.
The book is mainly telling the story through the words of the missionaries themselves, through the people themselves.
That's fantastic.
And it's warts and all.
And I have to say, Island Adventures sounds like a misnomer.
Well, there are a lot
didn't
of
sound like an adventure.
Well, yeah, there were a lot of trials and tribulations.
Sure. Wow. Once again, thank you so much for taking a few minutes and for your presentation. It was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
All right, and that was my discussion with John Hammond there. Like I said, very, very interesting. It's kind of interesting to understand the implications of these people's magical mindset, right? They had this idea that if they blessed people and the people were righteous, then they wouldn't be killed by the smallpox. Of course, we know that's not how epidemiology works. We understand how viruses spread from one person to another so much better than they did back then, but they seriously did believe that it was the scourge going through and cleansing the islands of the people that were unworthy, and hundreds died from it. It was really disgusting. So yeah, that was John Hammond, Island Adventures. Of course, there's a link to that book sold on Signature Books in the show notes. Be sure to check the show notes for that book. So moving on, there was also, I didn't take any audio or record any audio with these guys, but Infants on Thrones were there. I'm hoping to get 1 or 2 or 9 of them on the show at some point, because there's a whole bunch of people that run Infants on Thrones, and they were really cool guys. They had a table there, they were selling shirts, and they even broadcast a live episode from one of the rooms there, like 2:00 on Saturday. Unfortunately, that was at a time that I had to attend another history thing, so I couldn't get in on that, but you could hear the howls throughout the whole building. They had that room cracking up. So Infants on Thrones is going to be in the links. Their episode, I don't know if they have their episode up of the Sunstone presentation, but if it is, then it's going to be in the show notes as well. But I had a really good time just talking to him, to Brother Jake, to John Hamer, to all of the infants that were there. It was really fun discussing with them, and hopefully they're going to come on the show soon enough, and I'm going to go on their show eventually. But we'll see how it happens. As podcasters, we have a hard time nailing each other down for actual interviews or anything. But yeah, that's Infants on Thrones. They're known as philosophies of men mingled with humor. It's a little play on words of the temple ceremony. So, great podcast. Absolutely great podcast. All right, I know you're probably sick of hearing audio clips, but there are 2 more of them that I have to share here. They're both really short. The first one is from Lindsay Park. She was the assistant director of Sunstone, so she was responsible for a lot of the goings and the flowings of the symposium, and she did a fantastic job on an organizational level, as did everybody that was involved with the symposium. But also, if you're not familiar with Lindsay Park, she's part of the Feminist Mormon Housewives podcast umbrella. She specifically hosts hosted, I guess I should say, the Year of Polygamy podcast. And when people wonder where I get source information for Joseph Smith's wives, that's it. Year of Polygamy podcast. She does 1 episode at a time, going through Joseph's wives chronologically, and then through Brigham Young's wives. Really intense and amazing scholarship. The other podcast she's affiliated with is the Color of Heaven podcast, which is a much more dense and information-centric podcast than the Year of Polygamy is. It's not so much the stories of the people, but much more deep, heavy scholarship and historianship. So both of those, I haven't gone through all of Color of Heaven. I've gone through almost all of Year of Polygamy. They're both amazing podcasts. So without further ado, this is my interview with Lindsay Park. 5 minutes long. Be sure to check the show notes for links to her other podcasts. All right, I am sitting here with Lindsay Park, host of 2 amazing podcasts. When people ask me, where do I get my source material? She's one of my primary sources.
Oh, wow.
So I just have to say, Year of Polygamy, one of my favorite podcasts. You do such a fantastic job with that. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about it, as well as the Color of Heaven?
Yeah, so I do 2 podcasts for the Feminist Mormon Housewives podcast that have kind of spinned off into their own things. We have the Year of Polygamy podcast, which covers the history of Mormon polygamy from the beginning of the practice until modern day contemporary practices. So that means we talk about the history of Joseph Smith, all the revelations, basically any question or issue or controversy you've ever heard of with polygamy, we try to address it. And then we talk about Mormon fundamentalists. We have a lot of Mormon fundamentalists from all the different groups. And we talk about the history of Mormonism and how it intersects with Mormons living polygamy today. And there are a lot of Mormons living polygamy today. So that's the Year of Polygamy, 100 episodes. And then each year we come back and we do a few more episodes to update people on things we might have missed or update in scholarship and things like that.
If I'm not mistaken, there's a couple of episodes that are big panel discussions as well. Is that correct?
Yep, we have some panel discussions where we have a few people. We bring on, we try to bring on the biggest experts, the best scholars on each topic, and I think we've done that. I think we've gotten the best and brightest in Mormonism.
Especially, I mean, with the Year of Polygamy, definitely, and I would say even more so maybe with Color of Heaven. Of course, I haven't gone through all of the episodes. I know you're only, maybe 25 episodes in on that?
No, Color of Heaven, I think we're only on episode 13.
Oh, 13.
It's been a bit of a format change, so it's a lot of information. It's really scholarly. We're reformatting it this month, and we're going to try to make it in a way where the scholarship is more digestible. I am podcasting with two PhD scholars and professors, and they're brilliant, and I love them. But we really need to change the format so it's more digestible. We're going to talk about the way that Mormonism, the history of race in Mormonism, and the reason why I have co-hosts is because I'm a white Mormon woman, and it wouldn't be right for me to talk about these issues without having voices of color on there. So we have Gina Colvin from A Thoughtful Faith. She's Maori and not American, and we have Misha McGriggs, who's a PhD student at BYU, and she is Black. So they come on and they talk, and like I said, we're reformatting it, and we'll have some great episodes coming up soon.
Awesome. Yeah, I did my own Race in the Priesthood episode. I mean, it was like 4 hours long, but I did use a little bit of The Color of Heaven, where you do cover that. I think it was like episode 6, maybe, or 6 or 7, where you really dove deep into the Black ordination that happened in Nauvoo before Joseph died, and then how it shifted when Brigham Young took over the helm. So, I mean, if people are looking for other podcasts, concurrent podcasts that dive deep into history, are very scholarly, are very honest, don't take the scathing format that I frequently take. Your podcasts are just so amazing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we try to put our biases up front and let people decide for themselves with the information. My love is scholarship and reading, and since I work for Sunstone, I have access to so many documents a lot of people don't. And so what I do is I pay it forward, I read the information and try to digest it and put it out there for people, and then encourage them to do their own study. So that's what we do.
Fantastic. And I do have to say, from an attendee of Sunstone, thank you so much for your organization. This is my first year ever, and I cannot wait to keep coming back.
It's like our Mormon Comic-Con.
It is. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well said. I mean, it's history.
With
it's
more nerds. Mormon nerds.
I mean, and diverse points of view, too. I mean, I attended a discussion in this room from a very, very intelligent, believing scholar, and I was able to stand up there and talk with him for a couple of minutes, questioning him openly. And everybody's very open to discussion here. So
it's one of the very few places where Mormons of all stripes and ex-Mormons of all stripes and non-Mormons of all stripes come together, talk about Mormonism in a respectful way, and everybody just kind of loves each other through it. It's great.
That's awesome. Well, thank you once again so much for everything you do.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, that was my interview with Lindsay Park. She's just such a fantastic woman, does a great amount of scholarship, and she knows way more about Mormon history than I could ever hope to know. So, just absolutely love her work and love what she does. And then finally, the last piece of audio that I have to play for you guys today is with John Dehlin. If anybody doesn't know who John Dehlin is, he's the host of Mormon Stories podcast, which has been going for like 11 years now, and he is the director of the Open Stories Foundation. He's doing a lot to help Mormons, believers, non-believers, to cope with problems in Mormon history. His podcast, Mormon Stories, has like 600 and something episodes out at the time of recording this. I'm sure by the time this episode airs, it's going to be like 700 or 800 episodes, but who knows. Just really fantastic work. John Dehlin has done an amazing body of scholarship, but he was constantly surrounded by people. Absolutely constantly. And I just was able to snag him for 5 minutes and drag him outside and talk to him for a few minutes. And, this is the audio with John Dehlin. And be sure to check the show notes for links to his podcast and to the Open Stories Foundation. All right, I am standing here with the famed and extremely busy John Dehlin. He's the host of the Mormon Stories podcast, and I guess what we say, founder of the Open Stories Foundation. Is that fair?
Yep.
Tell us about that. If there's somebody who hasn't heard it, that's probably nobody in the world at this point. Tell us what you do.
Okay, great. So I started Mormon Stories podcast in 2005, which tried to help people talk openly about difficult issues in Mormonism. Since they couldn't do it in church. And at some point, I loved it so much that I wondered if I could do it more as kind of a job. And so I started soliciting donations. And
I got to say, this is 10 years ago. I mean,
11 years ago. 2005, yeah.
Okay.
And there's so much pain and so much need. I started talking to people and kind of becoming an informal counselor to people.
Okay.
And that's what led me to start my PhD in psychology in 2009.
So you could be formal about it. Right.
And then I just realized, man, I'd rather do Mormon Stories than just be a TA for some dumb class.
Right.
But I realized that people were much more willing to donate to a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit, than. So I started the Open Stories Foundation in 2010 to reward people for donating to Mormon Stories, and that then support skyrocketed. So as the Open Stories Foundation grew, I realized that there were many other needs out there. And so, for example, I convinced Jared Anderson to start a Mormon Sunday school podcast that he started. Mm-hmm. That started with us. He's branched off since then. Okay. I asked Dan Witherspoon to start Mormon Matters podcast, so that's an Open Stories, and that's a podcast dedicated to helping people stay in the church.
Yeah, and I just attended one of his discussions. I think it was yesterday. He has a very nuanced view on Mormonism, to say the least. Super nuanced. Very interesting, well-educated, interesting guy to listen to.
PhD, bright guy, sweetheart. Yeah,
definitely.
So I had Dan start Mormon Matters. I had Micah and Sarah Collette start A Thoughtful Faith that Gina Colvin has now taken over, so that's a podcast. Okay. I had Natasha Elfer Parker start a podcast called Mormon Mental Health. And my cousin Daniel Parkinson, who's a psychiatrist, started a podcast called Gay Mormon Stories. Mm-hmm. Brent Metcalf has done Mormon Studies podcast. He's put out a few episodes. So the Open Stories Foundation became sort of a Mormon public radio. Right. Sort of for lack of a better term.
Kind of an umbrella. That brings in all of this kind of an open inquiry session where you can come to the table with these challenging things, believers and non-believers alike, actually have an open discussion about it. Yep. And I admire that so much.
Yeah, like a podcast network. And then after I finished my PhD, I realized that there was an opportunity to do workshops and retreats because so many Mormons were suffering. Post-Mormons, transitioning Mormons were suffering in silence. Mm-hmm. They didn't have community. They didn't have a way to talk about their story and to meet other people to learn from them. So we've been holding these workshops and retreats as part of the Open Stories Foundation.
Awesome.
We've been doing them in Salt Lake City and Park City. We've gone to Dallas and Phoenix. We're going to Las Vegas in August.
Wow.
And it's basically just providing mental health tips and tricks for people who are transitioning, helping them improve their marriage, helping them raise their children without maybe the church or literal beliefs in the church, helping them improve relationships with believing family and friends. We have sex therapists sometimes come and help them learn how to have more healthier sex lives. And it's all about healing and growing during and after a transition because
that's tough. A lot of people don't have that community that they can go to. Yeah. And I think the noble cause of providing that community is something we can all rally behind. Yeah. And I just have to say, I mean, there's 600 plus episodes of your podcast too. So there are each of them's an hour to 2 hours long, and you sometimes will have somebody on for one discussion that's 9 hours long.
That's
so,
right.
I mean, if you're ever looking for a wealth of information to tap into, there's 10 years of scholarship there and discussions, and you just do amazing work. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Bryce, and I'm excited about Naked Mormonism, and it was fun to see you come online, and you're doing great work. So
thank you.
So keep it up.
Awesome, appreciate that.
All
right, and that was my my interview discussion, I guess you can call it, with John Dehlin. He's a fantastic guy, tall in stature and in personality. He's just a really great guy. He's friends with absolutely everybody at Sunstone, and he's just a genuinely good-hearted person. When you get to know him, he's just such a great guy. And also, I guess I have to thank Jason because he took a picture of us standing outside in the bright sunlight, both of us barely able to see, squinting our eyes. Took a picture of me standing in front of John holding the recorder up, and he said, 2 podcasters caught in the act. So good catch, Jason. Good picture. So that's up on the Facebook page. I shared it up there. So be sure to check that out as well. There were a couple of other things. I attended 3 full days of this Sunstone. There's so much that I'm leaving out, so much that I didn't talk about, discuss, and that I'm not remembering. I mean, even at the time I'm recording this nearly a week later, it's all just a blur in my mind because so much good happened, and I met so many amazing people and just discussed with so many people. I talked to so many people that, know Mormon history or are trying to dive into it, believers and non-believers alike. Current Mormons, ex-Mormons, never Mormons. It's just this giant weekend of everybody on different levels of the Mormon spectrum coming together and saying, let's talk. Let's have open discussion. not shoot down each other's beliefs. Let's really talk about some of these issues. Let's talk about the LGBT issues in the current church. The Sunstone Symposium has kind of been at the spearhead of bringing Mormon historians and scholars together, and bringing all of these people into one place so we can further scholarship, so we can understand deeper into Mormon history and understand each other's perspectives much better. So, all in all, there's multiple Sunstones, across the United States and in England, and in the United Kingdom. Well, I guess Britain isn't part of the United Kingdom anymore, but they do have a Sunstone UK. I think it's coming up later on in this year. There will be links to the Sunstone website in the show notes. If you have a chance, an opportunity, and you're able to get to a Sunstone, please do. I cannot stress that enough. I had so much fun. This was by far the most fun I've ever had at any sort of convention like this. You might think, 3 days of sitting around and listening to Mormon sermons and, presentations, that just sounds like a drag. If you like this show, then you will absolutely love everything at the Sunstone Symposium. Now, I do have to say, not all presentations were made equal, right? I mean, some of them were more interesting than others. Some of them were better in some ways, and others were better in other ways. I was not bored with a single presentation there. The entire 3 days, I was doing nothing but attending presentations and having discussions with other people, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Every one of the presentations was good in its own way. It didn't matter what the presentation was talking about or what they were trying to discuss. It was all just so awesome. It was so much fun. So I have to say there is a Sunstone coming up in Seattle in November, I believe. In November of this year, 2016. Should be coming up here, in the next couple months from when this is recorded here. And I'm trying to get a hold of somebody to discuss what it takes to be a presenter at these, because I would love to get up on the stage and actually present something about Mormon history that I've learned. They seem to be very open and very inviting with new information and new scholarship, new historianship. None of what I've done is new, but I guess my own naked perspective on some of it is new, and it's nuanced in my own way, and I would love to offer that. I'd love to present, but they just don't have a whole lot of information up about the Seattle one, because they just finished with the Salt Lake one, which is by far the biggest, most important one of the year. So please check the show notes for the Sunstone link, the Sunstone Symposium, and if you have a Sunstone near you coming up, whether it's this year, next year, or, years from now from when you might be hearing this, please take that opportunity. Even if you attend one presentation, if you attend one day, it doesn't matter. Just go to Sunstone. It is so much fun. I don't think I've ever had that much fun when it comes to Mormon history in my entire life. I was able to sit down with all of these people, all these historians and authors that I've revered for so long. I've read so much of their work, and I was able to sit down with them and just have a real discussion about deep Mormon history and Mormon topics. And, that was just an opportunity that I never would have had available unless I went to this Sunstone Symposium. So please, if you are interested in Mormon history, or you want to further your knowledge, or just, even if you're a Nevermo and you want to understand what, the Mormon culture is like, this is a great opportunity to open your mind, broaden your horizons, and see what is actually out there. It didn't matter who was giving the presentation or what their theological convictions were, whether they thought that Joseph Smith wasn't indeed a true prophet and the Book of Mormon was an ancient historical text, or they were like me and they knew that it was all bullshit. You could have the same conversation with every person that was there, and most of the people there knew what you were talking about. Never have I been to a convention or been anywhere in a public area where I can jump into a deep conversation about Mormon history with somebody and they're talking on the same level as me. Every time I've ever gone to any other convention, most of them are atheist conventions, and people are like, well, I don't know shit about Mormons. No, do not compute. They don't know what you're talking about, especially when you try and talk to them about Sidney Rigdon or Martin Harris or, Oliver Cowdery and how he slowly fell away from the church in 1838. You can't ever have this deep level of discussion about Mormon history anywhere else except for at Sunstone. So please, I implore you as the listener, if it's something that interests you, please, please, please follow the link to Sunstone in the show notes and see if there's a Sunstone near you in the near future. Because I'm probably just rambling about how good it is now, but it was just so much fun. I can't be emphatic enough about that. It was just a great opportunity to meet with these people, network with them, and really come to understand all of the different Mormonisms that are out there and how people are able to justify their beliefs in Joseph Smith and Mormonism. It was so great. I just had so much fun. Of course, a lot of the people that were presenting there are members of foundations. For example, there was Kimberly Anderson of the Mama Dragons, and the Mama Dragons are this group of mothers that are, mothers of LGBT youth, that the youth are living openly out and in the church, and the Mama Dragons are trying to basically advocate for their own sons and daughters and their own, transgender children, so they're able to be open and the mothers can defend them. And there's also a Dragon Dads or something, or Dragon Papas or something like that. So they have this this group that are trying to advocate for the normalcy of LGBT youth growing up in the church. And they're having a lot of effect on the church and how the church leadership handles LGBT youth in the church. We haven't seen any movement yet, but the more vocal that the Mama Dragons are and organizations like them are, I think the more we're eventually going to see the church come back towards the center on this, instead of being so crazy conservative about LGBT youth and LGBT families. So, the Mama Dragons were amazing. Kimberly Anderson, her presentation was great. She had 4 Mama Dragons that came up and told their story of when their kid came out to them and what they've done since, and how it's affected their lives and their families. It's just really compelling presentations. So that was absolutely great. Another couple of people that I met there were Joey and Andrew of the Pulpit Podcast. I've given their show a listen. There's a link to it in the show notes. Pulpit Podcast. They just talk. The couple of episodes I listened to, they talk about the Carthage jail shootout and how it could have been a conspiracy, which is stuff that I don't know yet. I haven't gotten there in my own history. But the information they were presenting sounds very compelling. And then I listened to the polygamy conspiracy as well. And these guys they're only 6 episodes in, but they're really doing a lot of good work. They know Mormon history quite well. And please check out the show notes for the Pulpit Podcast. Give them a listen. They're only 6 episodes in, so if you get in at the ground level, get in early on. Maybe maybe you'll be able to stick with them as their podcast progresses and gets better throughout the time. Of course, like every podcast, they're working out the kinks early on, but the guys have a good conversational dynamic. Joey and Andrew are cool guys, and it was really fun to talk with them. They attended a lot of the same presentations that I did, because I think they're just as interested in Mormon history as I am, maybe even more so. The Pulpit Podcast with Joey and Andrew, they're good guys doing some good work, and they're on their way to creating a really, really good body of work and knowledge on Mormonism and Mormon history. So check that out as well. So there was also one more discussion that I had with a guy named Mark, who runs lostmormonism.com. There's a link for this in the show notes as well. I'm trying to remember my discussion with the guy and when it happened, but I just have his name and his URL in my notebook here, and I can't remember the discussion I had. But just looking over his website, he has a lot of articles and blog posts on Mormonism and the early Mormon magic perspective, basically. There's, the different tabs that I'm looking through here. Is we have magic, Mormon myths, infamous Mormon, wives of Joseph Smith, a podcast that apparently is under construction at the moment, coming soon for the podcast. But, Lost Mormonism, be sure to look at that in the show notes as well. This guy, Mark, he has a lot of work, a lot of blog posts up here. And obviously this guy is building a body of scholarship on lostmormonism.com. Really great stuff there. So yeah, God, I think that's everything I had to talk about with Sunstone. Like I said, there's so much that I'm forgetting about right now. So many discussions and, talks that I had with various people, and I know that I'm forgetting a lot of them. People really were just great fun to talk with. At the end of last week's episode, I did say that I'll be at the Porcupine Pub in Salt Lake. That was just west of the U of U campus. U of U is where the symposium was held, and it was just bicycling distance away from the Porcupine Pub. So that's where we had basically an after symposium hangout there. A couple of people showed up, specifically John showed up, and he just had a good time talking with John, and he was he seems like a really, really good dude. He's kind of caught in an interfaith relationship right now, which sounds really shitty, and you can tell that it's really kind of draining him, but he's a super great guy, and I have great faith in his ability to make things work and to turn the situation for the best in his and his wife's favor. It's tough when it comes to interfaith relationships. That's one of the main things I get listener mail about, is people that are stuck in these. They wonder how to get their husband or their wife to read or to listen to a podcast or whatever to try and get them to open their mind on this. And the only thing I said to John really was like, dude, just leave Todd Compton's book In Sacred Loneliness out on the table or something and see if your wife reads it, because that's a very harrowing tale of Joseph Smith's wives. A lot of first-person accounts in there, and, it's just... it's really tough, and I really sympathize with people that have to go through this interfaith relationship transition, or just having to deal with their husband or their wife or whoever in their family still staying in the church. It's really tough. So John, keep it up, dude. You totally got this. Also, there were a few other people that I was able to spend some time with that I wanted to thank. Of course, there were Gordon and Paula. They gave a very generous donation, and I wanted to personally thank both of them for that. They attended quite a few of the same presentations that I did, and it was good just to see them in the crowd and wave to them, and they're just genuinely good people. I think I had maybe a 10-minute conversation with them, and people like this just warm your heart to have a discussion with. There was also Micah, who used to host the Reasonable Faith podcast. He's no longer reasonably faithing, I guess you can say. He's no longer in the church. He's he left, and he and I were able to hang out a little bit and discuss podcasting, and he's never heard of this show, so maybe if he's listening to it now, hey Micah, good to hang out with you, man. There was also David. David, I actually met with him in Washington, D.C. He said, are you coming to Reason Rally? I'll be there. And we were able to sit down in front of the Lincoln Memorial and have a pretty good discussion about him and his transition through the church, and, just Mormon history in general and how fascinating it is. And if not for David, I wouldn't have come to the Sunstone Symposium. I didn't even know about it until he told me about it, and then I looked it up. He sent me a link, and that's why I went to Sunstone in the first place. So it was really good to see him again and connect with him, eat lunch with him. Of course, there's Chuck. Chuck, I sat next to him at the very first presentation with the climate change and Mormon assets, and I saw him at a bunch of presentations after that, so it was a lot of fun to hang out with Chuck. He's a great dude. He told me about a couple things here. Let me find them. Yeah, Lowry Nelson, apparently there was a letter exchange between Lowry Nelson and somebody. I haven't looked these up yet, so Chuck, I promise I'm going to. And then also Eugene England McConkey, something going on with that. I'm trying to remember everything Chuck told me about him, but like I said, the whole weekend is an absolute blur to me. So I was sure to take pictures of his phone on my phone when he pulled those up, and then I wrote them in my notes here in my little black notebook. So I'm going to be looking into those and see if I can incorporate those into the timeline somehow. But yeah, it was just great hanging out with Chuck and talking to him all about the podcast and about Mormon history, and sitting next to him at so many of the presentations. Chuck's a great guy. Also, there was my friend Julie. Julie and I have hung out quite a few times up to this point, and she wasn't there for the first day, but she was there for the second and third day, and we went to a lot of the same presentations, and she's so much fun to talk to. I just enjoy hanging out with her every single time. She's on Twitter as Emma Hale, the real Emma Hale, I think, and she posts up all kinds of great stuff there. That's kind of where we've interacted the most, is on Twitter. So yeah, it's always fun to hang out with Julie, and she actually told me about a presentation, or a sermon, I guess you could call it, that Jeremy Runnels of the CES Letter was giving on Sunday at the Bountiful Heights Church there. So she and I attended that and went to see Jeremy Runnels in person of the CES Letter. You can look at the Facebook page. I took a picture with him, and he gave a fantastic presentation. Of course, Jeremy Runnels, he was recently excommunicated because of the CES Letter, and if you're wanting 75 or 80 pages, however long it is, of every single issue that's a big problem in Mormonism, the CES Letter is a great place to check it out. It says everything out concisely, very accurately, and basically he was excommunicated, or he excommunicated the church from his life because they couldn't answer the questions that he posed in the CES Letter. So it was just great fun to go to the Jeremy Runnels thing, to hang out with Julie and Chuck and with all these people that I talked about. Good hanging out with the Infants on Thrones. Just, it was, I hope I'm conveying my excitement properly here, because I just had way too much fun at this. It was so much fun. That's the best word for it. Just fun. It was great. I don't know what else to say about it. It was just the best time I think I've ever had at being part of a body of people that think so similarly and differently, and still are open to the same level of discussion at the same level. I mean, God, yeah, I can't describe it enough. That's all I can say is it was indescribably awesome. And I think everybody that has the opportunity needs to go to at least one Sunstone Symposium just to see what it's like, just to get a feel for what it was like to have this same interaction that I so thoroughly enjoyed for myself here. And one more thing to mention, I guess I also spent Sunday morning with Jared and with Dan, and we're in the final planning stages right now of launching a project that we've been working on for quite some time now. I know I've said it a couple of times. I've teased it in a couple of episodes so far. It just isn't quite ready yet, but when it does launch, I'm going to have both of them on for an episode, and we're going to talk through what everything is, what this project is. But, just keep in mind there is a large project coming down the pike, and I really hope that it's going to be well received. And, it's extremely exciting to sit down with these guys and talk with them about the possibilities of this project and where it's going to go after where it's at right now. So, in the next few episodes, I know I've said that a couple times in the last few episodes, but within the next, month or two here, we're going to get this project launched and, bring some details to the table and really discuss what the plans are for the future. So, it was great hanging out with Jared and Dan and hammering out some of the details there. Also, the guy that I said, Dan, he wrote a book called The Book of Mormon Comparison, and he's recently been on a podcast. There's going to be a link for in the show notes. He was recently on a podcast called Rainbow Radio Presents, and they've been discussing Mormon history for a couple of episodes now. There's going to be a link for it in the show notes. Rainbow Radio Presents. Dan was a great guy. I enjoy talking with him. The dude knows way more about Mormon history than I ever hoped to. And he's just a fascinating guy. He can just talk and talk forever, and you just sit there agape at how much he knows and how much he talks about it. And Dan's just an absolutely great guy. I haven't listened to the podcast quite yet, but I will be as soon as I'm done recording here. But check the show notes for Rainbow Radio Presents In My Honest Opinion with Nice Guy Eddie and special guest Dan Weiss. Really great guy to talk to there. And it's been a long episode here. This is surprising. I knew that it was going to take a while to get through the entire, Sunstone Symposium wrap-up just because it's such a huge, it takes a long time to talk about an entire weekend worth of content that's, still rattling around inside my skull. So, it was just so much fun. I know this episode has been long for just a special edition episode, for not a historical timeline episode, but hopefully the extra audio clips and interviews kind of jazzed it up. I'm once again sorry about the audio quality. I'm an absolute psycho when it comes to audio quality, but that was the best I could do on the fly there. But the content, like I said, hopefully the content made up for the terrible quality. Anyway, moving on, had a couple of new patrons to thank. Wow, support on Patreon has just continued to explode, and I have to thank everybody for it. It's just so great of you. New Nemo Juvenile Delinquents, we have Rebecca, Daniel, and Bobby. Rebecca, Daniel, and Bobby is actually a quarter above that, so thank you to all of you very much for supporting the show, signing up on Patreon. You pledge a certain dollar amount per episode. Next, there were some new Nemo Adolescent Rebels. Goodness, we have David and JP. Thank you both very much for supporting the show. That's awfully kind of you. You two are officially super awesome when it comes to supporting the show. And we have two new Nemo Adolescent Rebels. Goodness, we have Larry and Mark. Thank you both so much. That's absolutely awesome. And I have to say, Mark, his email address is dsnuts.com. So awesome. So Mark D's Nuts, that's just so epic of you. And then, amazingly enough, this is just... I'm flabbergasted here. We have a new Nemo demon, James Wharton. Goodness, James, thank you so very much. And thank you all so much to all of the patrons who support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. The influx of support since putting out that call a few episodes ago has just been huge. I seriously am overwhelmed with how great all of you are for pledging money to keep this show rolling, keeping it going, and making it so I can do this for a living and, keep pouring hours and hours of research into this as it does require to do. The more that I spend time researching this and doing work for this podcast and for other projects that I'm working on, like I kind of teased with Dan and Jared there, the more I'm coming to appreciate how much all of you mean to me and to the body of historianship, I guess you can call it, that this podcast stands for. It does require so much work. It does. I mean, I pour countless hours into this, and it's the most rewarding thing that I've ever been able to do. And the only reason that I have been able to do it is because I truly have the best listeners out there that are willing to support the show, that are willing to, buy the episodes as opposed to just, listen to them for free. So every one of you, listeners, supporters, all of you alike, thank you all so very much. You mean so much to me, and it's great to interact with you, to talk with you, to have your support, and to, most of all, meet you at conferences like Sunstone. All right. Finally, that's everything for the episode. There was one email that I wanted to address really quickly. Of course, there have been a few more emails of people sending in their transitions or their conversion stories, or deconversion stories, I should say. Please keep sending those in. I'm building up a bunch of them. Eventually, we're going to have another listener episode. I just love to read those. I love to get those in. But this email that I got in was from Cindy, and it's asking a specific question. And she said, quote, "In episode 36, you read an excerpt from Sidney Rigdon explaining the nature of God, also one from Oliver Cowdery. I assume these were written in 1836. However, if you use the narrative that the church provides, the best way to find out what the nature of God would be is to ask Oliver directly. Didn't he see Jesus in the Kirtland Temple? Or better yet, ask Joseph. He saw both God and Jesus in 1820. And before reading the rest of the email, I have to say, if you use the narrative that the church provides, that's the problem, right? We can't necessarily use the narrative the church provides because from a historical perspective, it's not reliable. Joseph Smith supposedly saw both God and Jesus in 1820. That's supposedly according to the 1838 version that was published in 1842. If you look at the 1834 and 35 version, there's no mention of God and Jesus as separate human beings. There's just angels, basically. If you look at the 1832 version, which is the earliest version that we have, which was recorded 12 years after it supposedly happened in 1820, Joseph Smith himself said that it would happen in 1821 or 22 when he was 17. And instead of happening in 1820, it says that the heavens opened up to him, not that a being descended in a pillar of fire or a pillar of light, and it just said that God said his sins are forgiven him. It didn't say anything about founding a church and not joining any of the other churches because they're evil and their professors are false. It doesn't go on to make any of the details that we know in the current 1838 version that's included in the history of the church. So that's why we can't, as you said, Cindy, use the narrative that the church provides, because the nature of God didn't seem to matter much to Joseph Smith. Now, when it came to Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon, they were opposed in many ways. Sidney Rigdon kind of started taking over the church more so than Oliver Cowdery did. By the time 1838 rolled around, they were so opposed that Oliver Cowdery had to leave the church, basically be disfellowshipped from it. Sidney Rigdon, however, a lot of his stances on God and on communism and on what religion should be, oddly enough, find their way into the Book of Mormon, as well as into the early narratives that he wrote, early articles that he wrote in the church's publications, whether it was the Morning and Evening Star or the Millennial Star or the Messenger and Advocate or whatever. He seems to have a huge influence on Mormon theology, and much more so than Oliver Cowdery ever did. So the nature of God, as we understand it today, is much more in line with what Sidney Rigdon proposed instead of what Oliver Cowdery proposed, even though Sidney Rigdon never claimed to have seen God. And I don't believe that Oliver actually claimed to see God. He saw prophets. He saw Moses, Elijah, Elias, so on and so forth in the Kirtland Temple, but I don't think he ever saw God. Just Joseph Smith saw God and Jesus supposedly in 1820, but that's only according to the latest version that Joseph wrote before his death, which was published 22 years after it supposedly happened. So, historically reliable? No. Nature of God, we can't trust Joseph Smith on it because he had an ever-changing version of it. Oliver Cowdery had a typical Trinitarian, almost Methodist perspective of an infinite God that's, not of flesh and bone. And then Sidney Rigdon had this idea that God is finite, of flesh and bone, and that's the narrative that we see won out in Mormon history and what they espouse today. So, unfortunately, it's not quite as easy as asking Joseph or asking Oliver or asking Sidney Rigdon what they thought, because the competing narratives just don't comport with each other. When we look at it from a historian's perspective, not just from a believer or non-believers, but an actual historian kind of perspective, and we analyze these competing narratives, we have to say, what makes the most amount of sense? And it turns out none of it does. So that's a problem. To finish out with her email, she says, it seems odd to have top officials in the church writing about the nature of God and disagreeing. It doesn't seem odd to me because everybody believes in their own version of God. I think it's very typical that we see leading members of a church competing about what the actual nature of God is. She says, if there is an eyewitness, why are they even writing this stuff? The idea for a first vision story of Joseph must have come up after 1836, even though there are stories of his retelling the experience prior to this. And I would just say, it kind of goes from going back to his 1832 version. That was the first time that it was ever talked about that Joseph saw anything in the sacred grove or anything relating to that. Before that, there was absolutely nothing relating to Joseph seeing angel or, seeing God before the angel Moroni or the angel Nephi came down to deliver the plates to him. After that, after 1836, it was around 1835-36 that David Whitmer, Martin Harris, so on and so forth started talking about this first vision experience, and it started being discussed in church publications. So, I mean, it's arguable that if it starts being talked about 16 years after it actually happened, then it probably didn't actually happen the way that it's understood to have happened in the latest version, which is what they espouse now. And when you're like examining witness testimony, you know, Grant and I talked about that in this episode, Grant Palmer. When you examine a witness testimony, it's supposed to get more fuzzy, more cloudy. The details are supposed to get, less detailed as time progresses. But when we examine the competing claims, the later claims, 32 versus 34, 35, and 38 of Joseph's first vision experience, they get more detailed. They become more exciting and more grandiose. There's more angels. There's, it goes from just an angel or just a visage all the way up to God and Jesus separately in human form, descending in a pillar of light over his head in physical beings. And, before that happens, he has this epic battle with the adversary that was binding his tongue to his mouth. And, it's normally when it comes to something that actually happened, we don't see this embellishment. We don't see this progression of things becoming more and more legendary and grandiose. We see things becoming more and more fuzzy. So, like Grant said, if that happened in a court of law, that would be impeached. Simple as that. As far as people disagreeing to it, as to the nature of God, when it comes to basically any religious sect, it happens. Simple as that. That's why there was a huge schism when Joseph Smith died, because everybody that was in a leadership position of the church felt like they had the correct leadership authority and that they knew the nature of God and that they were gaining revelations. That's why it broke off to James Strang and to Mother Emma and to Joseph Smith III, over to David Whitmer, over to Brigham Young, over to Sidney Rigdon. All of these different important people felt like they had proper succession authority after Joseph Smith, and they all had their own views on what Mormonism and what God are. So, I mean, it's to be perfectly expected. It happens with basically any religion. But that was it for listener mail. And Cindy, thank you very much for sending that in. I hope I addressed your question. I don't think there was a single question mark in there, but hopefully I addressed everything that you were, making statements about. And basically the historical narrative as we find it, they're just not reliable. Simple as that. So, oh well, that's what happens. I guess it's to be perfectly expected. But finally, after much ado, that is the end of this episode. It has been a long one. My sincerest apologies. But like I said, there's just so much to talk about when it comes to Sunstone. And please go if you have the opportunity to. One more thing to mention, I was also featured on an episode of Know the Truth podcast. It's Jason Camo's podcast, Pastor Jay's podcast. Apparently he's traveling through Utah, and there was a little altercation that he ran into with the local police force, the very heavily Mormon police force. So be sure to check the show notes for the Know the Truth Ministries podcast. But before pressing and holding the power button to shut it down tonight, there are a few people I need to thank. First off, I need to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. She does a great job there. Please check the Facebook page. We are 15 likes away from 1,000 likes. So close. Also need to thank Craig Keeling, host of the blog WeirdMormonShit.com. He provides the artwork that's used in this show, as well as the daughter show, the Glassbox Podcast, with his permission. Thank you very much, Craig. Also need to thank Jason Camo of LostStateOfMind.com for providing the music that's used in this show with his permission. If you'd like to leave a voicemail to be played on the next historical episode, be sure to call 864-NAKED-MO or 864-625-3366. Call in, it goes straight to voicemail, and you can leave your voicemail there any amount of time talking about anything. And, even if you want to tell your story, whatever the case may be. Also want to thank every one of you beautiful patrons who support the show. You are all fantastic, and I just cannot express my appreciation enough. Also, if anybody wants to rate the show on iTunes or Stitcher or their podcasting vehicle of choice, that would be deeply appreciated as well. But most of all, I need to thank all of you amazing listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
started.
Okay.
Bringing in headline religious Christians.
Okay.
They brought in Dominic Crossan last year. This year they have this Arabic scholar.
Okay.
The numbers are higher.
Oh, wow. So it's just growing then, basically.
It's growing.
How many symposiums have you been to then?
Oh, I don't know. I moved back from California to Utah in 1980. Oh, during that time I probably spoken at 6 or 7 and maybe been to 15.
Oh, wow. No kidding. I'm jealous. This is, I mean, my first one. I'm loving it here, and I'm glad that I'm catching it on the cusp that it's getting, the
and there's a lot of young people here. This is so it's going to perpetuate because
I think so.
With the internet, this thing was started before the internet, and
wasn't this
all the 2 or 3 people in each ward who wanted more than what they offered in the Mormon Sunday school came here into this big tent. But now they compete with the internet, which is anyone doesn't even have to get out of their chair. But I'm glad to see this going on the way it is, and young people are embracing it. And the issues are a little different now than they were 30, 40 years ago. But
still somehow the same, though, I think.
Yeah, somehow there's a thread through it all.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to start recording it here and just kind of introduce you.